A full review of the Leo Frank case, an audiobook read by John D. Nugent, based upon an article written in March of 1915, 100 years ago, by the crusading Georgia publisher Thomas Watson. This article is the latest token of my 3-year commitment on my website, johndnugent.com, and over at leofrank.org, to the Leo Frank Mary Fagan case, the first Jewish national media campaign to get one of their own murderers off by screaming that the trial was all about white bigotry, prejudice, and anti-Semitism. But it failed. For once, thanks to this article you'll be hearing, and others by crusading publisher Thomas Watson, a powerful Jew whom 2 juries and 5 courts had sentenced to death finally got his just deserts from the gallant Southern men of Georgia who said, "Don't mess with our women, Jew," and he was taken out of a state prison, and he was hanged by the neck until dead. Publisher and later U.S. Senator Thomas Watson wrote, "Leo Frank belongs to the Jewish aristocracy, and it was determined by the rich Jews that no aristocrat of their race should die for the death of a working-class Gentile." This was indeed a sensational trial involving the rape and murder of a 13-year-old pencil factory working girl named Mary Ann Fagan from a very fine Southern Georgia family by her own boss, the manager of the pencil factory, the National Pencil Factory, named Leo Frank, who was a Jew born in Texas but who had grown up in Brooklyn in New York City. The case, of course, attracted tremendous attention because Mary Ann Fagan had been a beautiful girl of excellent character, extremely popular, beloved, really. She was one of those people that to know her is to love her. And she looked like an angel. In fact, she was always asked to play the princess in plays and the Sleeping Beauty and things like that. And so when she was raped and murdered, this caused tremendous anger. Crowds thronged to each day of the 3-week trial in August 1913 of Leo Frank, and strikingly, even all 3 Jews on the grand jury had voted to indict the hated child rapist, torturer, and strangler Leo Frank. But the J-Team did not give up in their efforts to get him off after he was convicted and sentenced to death, wasting the time of the courts, including the Georgia Court of Appeals, the Georgia Supreme Court, and the U.S. Court of Appeals. An alarmed publisher, Tom Watson, then leapt in with this article that you'll be hearing to remind Georgians how blatantly guilty this Hebrew whoremonger, lecher, witness briber, darling of New York Jewry, and child killer was. Let us not forget that this man was not just any Jewish person, but he was the president of the B'nai B'rith Jewish Organization of Georgia. As my previous audiobooks have pointed out, based on the work of Thomas Watson, especially the January 1915 article a few months earlier by that great publisher, an article which really fired up the people of Georgia, the Jews would stop at nothing to get Leo Frank off because he was a high Jewish official. An excerpt from the very good website tribaltheocrat.com entitled "The Leo Frank Murder, Semitism Birthing Anti-Semitism." It shows how the Jews provoked anti-Semitism in the South that had never existed before. And now, here is a quote from that article. "A week after the 1913 trial, death sentence, and rejection of the first appeal, Jews Jacob Schiff and Albert Lasker entered the fray. Schiff was perhaps the most powerful Jew in America, the managing partner of the merchant banking house of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. He and the American Jewish Committee met at a New York temple and agreed to hire Lasker, a wealthy advertising tycoon from Chicago, who had the reputation of detesting anti-Semitism. Lasker was able to put together $3,000, the equivalent of $67,000 in today's money, for the Frank cause, split among himself, his father, and the Jew Julius Rosenwald, chairman of Sears Roebuck and Company. Lasker would personally end up putting $100,000, over $2.2 million today, in the fight for Frank. With the help of Adolph Ochs and his New York Times newspaper, the Jew juggernaut for Frank was making speed. But as the publicity campaign for Frank became pervasive, it also became noticeably Jewish, and any anti-Semitism that would develop in Georgia was a direct result of Semitism. As for Albert D. Lasker, he got rich by creating ads for Lucky Strike cigarettes, claiming that smoking coffin nails would make American women thin. Well, death does make people thin. Lasker went out and hired William J. Burns, the world's highest-paid detective, for $4,500, over $100,000 today, to come to Georgia and investigate the case. This coincided nicely with the phrase from Leo Frank's own lips, "The truth is on the march," which was feverishly circulating in the headlines. The New York Times dubbed Burns the greatest detective, certainly, and perhaps the only really great detective, the only detective of genius whom this country has produced. Burns' entry into the campaign and his subsequent unscrupulous activities would awaken Tom Watson, a lawyer and a brilliant polemicist who acquired the nickname the Sage of McDuffie County. As the editor for the Jeffersonian, a weekly newspaper in Atlanta, Watson spoke for Georgians, the overwhelming majority of whom wanted Frank to hang. As author E. Michael Jones writes, quote, Watson seemed not only capable, but willing to articulate the questions on everyone's mind. And now, here it is, from Watson's Magazine, Volume 20, Number 5, of March 1915, a full review of the Leo Frank case. And I will repeat that this article was so powerful that it led indirectly to the lynching of Leo Frank. It led to the crisis, which led to the governor of Georgia making a very foolish move, and it led to the finest citizens of the state of Georgia, not a mob, but the finest citizens of Georgia, storming into a prison, dragging this Jew out, driving all night through the back roads, back to Marietta, Georgia, where this little girl had grown up on a farm, and hanging her within sight of her farm. So this is the article that sealed the doom of the child murderer, rapist, pedophile, and all-around lecher who had sexually harassed many working girls at the pencil factory, Leo Frank. To begin. On the 23rd page of Puck, editor's commentary, this was a very famous satirical and humorous magazine across the United States 100 years ago. For the week ending January 16, 1915, there is in the smallest possible type, in the smallest possible space, at the bottom of the page, the notice of ownership required by law. Mankind is informed that Puck is published by a corporation of the same name, Nathan Strauss, Jr., being president, and H. Grant Strauss, being secretary and treasurer. You are authorized, therefore, to give credit to the Strauss family for the unparalleled campaign of falsehood and defamation which Puck has persistently waged against the state of Georgia, her people, and her courts. Inasmuch as the Strauss family once lived in Georgia, and are loudly professing their ardent devotion to the state of their birth, you may feel especially interested in Puck. Looking over the pages of this Strauss publication, I find a characteristic thing. On page 22, there is an illustrated advertisement of Sunnybrook whiskey, which is recommended as, quote, a delightful beverage and a wholesome tonic, unquote. To give force to the words of testimonial, there is a picture of an ideally good-looking man, and this smiling Apollo is pointing his index finger at a large bottle of the delightful Sunnybrook firewater. On the next page is a strikingly boxed advertisement of the Keeley Cure Treatment, with reference to such nationally known stew-it-out resorts as Hot Springs, Arkansas, Jacksonville, Florida, and Atlanta, Georgia. The advertisement states that the Keeley Cure is John Barleycorn's master. In other words, it would help you beat your addiction to whiskey. And that during the last 35 years, 500,000 victims of the drink appetite have been cured. Therefore, the Strauss magazine is open to contributions from both sides. Those who don't want the key liqueur are told where to get the liquor, while those who've had too much of the liquor are told where to get the key liqueur. In either event, the Strauss family continues to do business and to add diligent shekels to the family pile. Puck is one of those magazines which indulges in fun for the entertainment of the human race. You can nearly always tell what sort of a man it is by the jokes he carries around with him. In parallel column to the ad of the Sunnybrook whiskey, Puck places a delicate little bit of humor, like this poem. "We stand behind the goods we sell," the silver-throated salesman said. "No, no," cried pretty, blushing Nell. "You see, I want to buy a bed." Another bit of refined fun, which is so good that the Strauss family went to the expense of a quarter-page cartoon, represents a portly evangelical bishop, seated in the elegant room of a young mother who is at the tea-table close by, pouring the beverage which cheers, but not inebriates. Her little boy sits on the bishop's knee, and the kindly gentleman, with one hand on the lad's plump limb, exclaims, my, what sturdy little legs!" And the boy answers, "Oh, you ought to see mother's!" And the mother is an arm's length of the bishop. The tone of Puck and its sense of responsibility to its readers, when discussing matters of the gravest public concern, is shown by its treatment of the profoundly serious and important subject of prohibition. Editor's note: that was the decades-long crusade in the U.S. to ban alcoholic beverages, which crusade turned into a federal law from 1919 to 1933. I quote what Puck says, not to exhibit Richmond Pearson Hobson, or the pros and cons of congressional legislation on that question, but to exhibit the levity and dishonesty of Puck. Congress was treated to an excellent vaudeville a few days ago as part of the prohibition propaganda engineered by that earnest young white-ribboner Richard Pearson Hobson. From all press reports of the session, it must have been an inspiring sight. Mr. Hobson had placed in the well of the House of Representatives, the big space in front of the clerk's desk, 20 large lettered placards pointing out the alleged evils of, quote, the liquor curse, unquote. Some of these placards were, "Alcoholic dogs had more feeble and defective puppies," unquote. Quote, "Destructive effect of alcohol on guinea pigs," unquote. And there's a quote from the New York Tribune. Puck has long pointed out the terrible effects of alcoholic indulgence among our canine friends. It feels with Mr. Hobson a heartfelt pity at the picture of a tipsy terrier going home to a boneless doghouse and a hungry litter. Mr. Hobson's flapdoodle did not stop there. He rants. The National Liquor Trust in America opened 4 different headquarters in Alabama and conducted the major part of the great campaign against me with their 100 stenographers and 800 men on the salaried payroll. I found out also that Wall Street, and I am not guessing, raised a fund which was sent there to defeat me. Another quote from the New York Tribune. Poor old Wall Street. No sooner is it out of the doldrums of an enforced vacation than is dragged into action to lead that peerless force of 100 stenographers and 800 salaried men against Mr. Hobson. It is a heart-rending picture, the spectacle of impoverished financiers passing round the hat to collect a fund to be used in behalf of the demon rum. Wall Street reeks with whiskey, if we believe the oratory of Prohibition's Alabama advocate. But to continue, quote, that whiskey is killing daily more men in the United States than the war is taking away in Europe, was one of the statements emphasized by Mr. Hobson. Quote from the New York Tribune. Is it to be wondered that the cause of prohibition, championed with such rubbish as this, met with a decisive and well-deserved defeat in Congress? The prominent feature of this number of Puck is another full-page cartoon by Hy Mayer, Jewish name, representing Leo Frank, this time as an innocent prisoner barred from his freedom by the symbolic columns of wisdom, justice, and moderation, as they appear on George's coat of arms. The Strauss accusation is that the state has falsified her own motto and converted her temple into a Bastille. Editor's note, that was a famous French prison, through whose bars the innocent Frank is gazing outward for the liberty of which he has been so unlawfully deprived. A paragraph on another page runs thus: "In safe hands at last. Perhaps the Georgia mob that hooted its way to fame outside the courtroom where Frank was being tried for his life will now pack up its carpetbags and journey to Washington. The Supreme Court of the United States will doubtless be tremendously overawed by a demonstration of mob violence on the part of an Atlanta delegation." What are people to do when mercenary detectives and newspapers and Hessians of the pen — editor's note, the word Hessians refers to German mercenaries who were paid to fight against the Americans in the American Revolution. People used to know who the Hessians were. They were soldiers for hire. I'll repeat. What are people to do when mercenary detectives and newspapers and Hessians of the pen hire themselves to push a propaganda of libel and race prejudice in the determined effort to hide the evidence of Frank's guilt, nullify the calm decisions of our highest court, and substitute the clamor of big money for the stern, impartial mandate of the law? In this same issue of the Strauss magazine is another cartoon by a Mr. Desaias, labeled "Alone in Her Shame." The subject of odium is the state of Georgia, and she's pictured as being pointed at by the scornful fingers of all the other states. If this kind of thing could work a mercurial public into hysteria, or hypnotize a governor into a blue funk, what rich criminal would ever go to the scaffold? If big money can hire Hessians enough to fight Frank's way out of the consequences of his awful crime, what is it that big money cannot do? In the same Strauss's magazine for January 30th, there was a still more insulting and defamatory cartoon. We reproduce it for the information of our readers. It pictures the state of Georgia as a masked ruffian, with a coil of rope in his hand, trying to seize Leo Frank and lynch him without a legal trial. The witnesses to the scene are Uncle Sam and a touring car full of the other states in the Union. Editor's note, again depicted as being beautiful women, 49 beautiful women, the other states of the Union, and they're in this all looking in horror. A guide with a megaphone is proclaiming the infamy of Georgia. On my blog, at johnnugent.com, you can see this cartoon. My comment is, the constant meme of Puck was, the bigoted anti-Semitic mob has taken over Georgia. The other states depicted as beautiful women look on in horror at evil Georgia in their touring car, driven by Uncle Sam. The real message: cross us Jews, and you will be made into a pariah. Watson. In all of the months during which William J. Burns, the detective, has been working these agencies to create sentiment in favor of Frank, not a page of the essential sworn testimony has been given to the public. On the contrary, the wildest rumors and the most craftily devised falsehoods have been put into circulation in the effort to get a favorable verdict from unthinking editors and readers who are slow to suspect that there is a systematic campaign of willful lies. Excuse me for speaking plainly. The time has come for it. Let us begin with Collier's magazine. This is the weekly paper which has sold books in so many peculiar ways and made a nationwide campaign against patent medicines and then stopped quite suddenly. It is the paper which editorially accused the white women of the United States of squealing on their Negro paramours and thereby causing them to be lynched to avoid scandal. The exact language of Collier's was, "It is well known that many identifications," editor's note, this is referring to white women who point to a black man and say, "That's the one that raped me," in, say, a police lineup. It is well known that many identifications are mere hysteria, often for crimes that were never committed, and many charges and identifications are founded on something worse than hysterical invention. They're the easiest escape from scandal. Now, these are not the things to say, no doubt. They altogether lack chivalry and the aristocratic virtues, but perhaps it is time to put justice and truth above honor, whatever that may be. Thus spoke Collier's editorially in October 1908. Editor's commentary. Back 100 years ago, the topic of black men raping white women was considered to be very serious. It was spoken about openly. Really, a great deal of the lynchings that happened in the South and other parts of the United States between 1880 and 1920, which is the heyday of lynching, mostly in the South, but definitely not just in the South, also in California, Minnesota, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, places like that. There was lynchings in many states. There was great concern about black men raping white women. So what Collier's of Philadelphia is saying, this national magazine, is white women want sex with black guys, but if their husbands find out, then they accuse their black lover of being a rapist. That's what Collier's is saying here. Returning to Watson's article, is Collier's the kind of publication which you would select for the championship of truth? Is Collier's the weekly that would go to great expense in the Frank case for the holy sake of justice? C.P. Connolly, editor's note, this has been a supposed muckraking investigative journalist who's been involved with Baltimore newspapers. He was very well known at that time. C.P. Connolly has been with William J. Burns, the detective, in the McNamara cases, and Burns took up Connolly in the Frank case to blow some bugles through the Baltimore Sun, the daily paper of the worthy Abel family, which is a Jewish family. After the Abels got through with Connolly, Collier's picked him up and translated him, it's an old-fashioned word for transferred him, translated him to Atlanta. What did he do there? With whom did he talk? How did he try to get at the facts of the Frank case? He did not go over the record, not with the solicitor. Solicitor is the word in Georgia for the district attorney, who was familiar with it and who proffered his services to Connolly for that very purpose. Solicitor or district attorney was Hugh Dorsey, who got Leo Frank convicted of murder despite intense pressure. If Mr. Connolly came down here for the truth, why did not listen to both sides? Why did not read the record? Or if he did read it, why did he so grossly misrepresent it? Let us examine a few of Connolly's statements, statements which, being accepted as true, have poisoned the minds of honest people throughout the Union, just as they were meant to do. Connolly says, quote, Leo M. Frank is a young man of whose intellectual attainments any community might well be proud. Atlanta has been combed to find something against his moral character, but without success. Unquote. There you have a flat, positive assertion that the city of Atlanta was diligently searched for witnesses who would testify against Frank's moral character, and that none could be found. What will be your amazement and indignation when I tell you that numerous white girls and white women went up on the witness stand and swore under oath against Frank's moral character? One after another, these white accusers braved the public ordeal and testified that Frank was lewd, lascivious, and immoral. Frank's lawyers sat there in silence, not daring to ask those witnesses for the details upon which they based their terrible testimony. Why did Frank's lawyers allow that fearful evidence to have its full effect upon the jury, without asking those white women what it was they knew about Leo Frank? Now suppose you had been accused in this case, and those same witnesses had testified against your character. Would you have been afraid to cross-examine them? Only a man who shrank from what those women could tell on him would have let them go, without a single word of objection. The state could not ask them for specific facts. The defendant alone had the legal right to ask for those, and the defense was afraid to do it. Among those white witnesses were Miss Mary Karst, Miss Nellie Pettis, Miss Maggie Griffin, Miss Carrie Smith, Mrs. C.D. Donegan, Miss Myrtle Cato, Mrs. Estelle Winkle, Mrs. M.E. Wallace, Mrs. H.R. Johnson, and Miss Mary Davis. Another white girl who did not know enough of Frank's general character for lasciviousness to swear against it was offered by the state to prove that she went to work in Frank's factory and that Frank made an indecent proposal to her on the second day. Now, Frank's lawyers objected to that evidence, and Judge Ellis Rohn ruled it out. But if Connolly was eagerly bent on finding the truth as to Frank's character, he would certainly have heard of Miss Nellie Wood, who doubtless could tell Connolly at any time the exact language that Frank used in his effort to corrupt her. When you pause to consider that here were many white witnesses, none of whom could be impeached, who took a solemn oath in open court upon the Bible in the face of God and swore to Frank's immoral character, standing ready to bear the brunt of the cross-examination of the crack lawyers of the Atlanta bar. What do you think of Connolly when he states that no such witnesses could be found? And what do you think of Burns, who pulled off the jackass stunt of afterwards offering, quote, a reward, unquote, for any such witnesses that might appear? The witnesses were on the witness stand. With reference to his said offer of the $5,000 reward, this impostor, William J. Burns, said on February 3 in the newspaper Kansas City Star, which is disinterestedly, no doubt, giving so much space to the campaign of slander against the people and courts of Georgia. Again, these are Burns's words. "Let me tell you this. No man has a more remarkable past than Frank. I investigated every act of his life prior to the accusation against him. There was not a scratch on it, and I offered a reward of $5,000 to anyone who could prove the slightest immorality against him. No one, not even the Atlanta police, have attempted to claim it," unquote. Instead of his flamboyant and empty offer of $5,000, why didn't Burns quietly take Reverend John E. White or some other respectable witness with him and visit the white ladies who had already publicly testified to Frank's lewd character? Those white ladies were right there in Atlanta, while that noisy ass, Burns, was braying to the universe. The record showed him their names. If he wanted to know what they could tell on Frank, why didn't he go and ask them? He knew very well that no one would claim this reward, for he knew there wasn't anybody who was fool enough to believe they would ever see the color of his money. If he wants to learn the truth about Frank's double life, he can go to those ladies now. Why doesn't he do it? He can save his imaginary $5,000 and ascertain the truth at the same time. The mendacious scoundrel was quick enough to hunt up Miss Montine Stover and use his utmost efforts to scare her into changing her evidence. Editor's note, Montine Stover was an absolutely key witness because she had gone in to pick up her pay around the same time as Mary Fagan. But when she came to pick up her little packet of cash, money for a week's work, on that Saturday in the pencil factory, she was gone, but he was also gone. And the reason why he was gone is that he was raping and murdering her somewhere else in the factory. And she testified that she was there between 12 and 12:15, right after noontime, in Leo Frank's office, wondered where he was, didn't see him, and, obviously was bothered. She'd come to pick up her money, and the office was empty. Very strange. So that's who Miss Montine Stover was. Let me just repeat the sentence. The mendacious scoundrel was quick enough to hunt up Miss Montine Stover and use his utmost efforts to scare her into changing her evidence. He went so far as to entrap her in Samuel Boorstein's law office. The attempt was made to hold her by force. Other girl witnesses in the case were subjected to persecution and threats by these infamous Burns detectives, who wanted to change their evidence as they did change the fearful evidence of Frank's Negro cook. What does that refer to? Is that the black African-American cook in the Frank family household had overheard a discussion between Leo Frank and his wife, where he admitted to his wife that he'd done something terrible. She stated it to the police, and then she withdrew her statement. Returning to Watson, why was Burns afraid to ask Mrs. Johnson or Mrs. Winkle or Mrs. Donegan what it was that caused them to swear that Leo Frank is a libertine? Miserable faker. He didn't want the truth. Do William J. Burns and Luther Rosser, Luther Rosser was one of these top lawyers for the Leo Frank dream team, mean to say that all these respectable white girls and ladies who swore to Frank's immoral character perjured themselves? If so, what motive did they have? And if Rosser was satisfied those ladies were swearing falsely, why didn't he cross-examine them? Why was he afraid to ask them one single question? Your common sense tells you why. Rosser feared what would come out. Another statement made by Connolly is that the face of the dead girl, quote, was pitted and seamed with indentations and scratches from the cinders, a bank of which stretched along the cellar for 100 feet or more. There had evidently been a struggle, unquote. Editor's note, what this refers to is, the truth is Mary Fagan was raped upstairs in a room in the manufacturing part of the factory near the bathroom on the same floor as Leo Frank's office. And then the body was dragged down to the basement and terribly face down. So her face was bumping along the rocks and the stones of the rough basement floor and cinders, because, there was a coal-fired furnace to run the factory, and there was cinders and coal dust and things like that. So her face was very, very battered from being dragged along rocks and black soot. I'll repeat that paragraph. Another statement made by Connolly is that the face of the dead girl, quote, was pitted and seamed with indentations and scratches from the cinders, a bank of which stretched along the cellar for 100 feet or more. There had evidently been a struggle, unquote. Again, Connolly says, there were cinders and sawdust in the girl's nose and mouth, drawn in the act of breathing and under her fingernails. Her face had been rubbed before death into these cinders, evidently in the attempt to smother her cries. Back to Watson. Here the purpose of Connolly was to make it appear that Mary Fagan had been killed in the basement, after a struggle, during which her mouth had been held down in the cinders to stifle her screams. In that event, of course, her tongue, her mouth, her throat, and perhaps her lungs would have shown inhalation of sawdust and cinders. But there is absolutely no evidence in the record or the autopsy to support any such theory. There was absolutely no evidence of any long bank of cinders, unquote, in the basement. There was, in fact, no such bank of cinders. The evidence of all the witnesses is that the girl's tongue protruded from her mouth, editor's note, from being strangled after or while she was being raped by Leo Frank, and that the heavy twine cord, editor's note, which had been used to strangle her, because she was resisting, the 13-year-old girl was heroically resisting being raped by this 35-year-old Jew. So he strangled her to stop her from resisting rape. Okay, I repeat. The evidence of all the witnesses is that the girl's tongue protruded from her mouth from being strangled after or while she was being raped, and that the heavy twine cord had cut into the tender flesh of her neck, and that the blood settlings showed the stopped circulation, manifest not only in her purple-black face, but under the blue fingernails. Again, there are pictures of all this on my blog at johnnnugent.com or at leofrank.org. There was no evidence whatsoever of cinders, ashes, or sawdust in her mouth, in her throat, or in her lungs. There was not a scintilla of evidence that she met her death in the basement. The sworn testimony in the record is that although the girl's face was dirty from having been dragged by her heels face down through the coal dust and grime natural to the basement where the furnace was, the Negro who first saw her that night, that's referring to Newt Lee, the black night watchman. In those days, blacks were always called Negroes. By the glimmer of a smoky lantern, telephoned to the police that it was a white girl. The officers Anderson and Starnes so testified. Sergeant Dobbs swore that the body seemed to have been dragged by the heels over the dirt and coal dust, and the trail led back from the corpse to the elevator. His exact words are, "It began immediately in front of the elevator at the bottom of the elevator shaft." The word "it" refers to the trail of the dragged body, and the witness swore that the condition of the girl's face had been made from the dragging. There was the unmistakable sign of the dragged body, as legible as the track of a foot on the soft ground, and the weight of the head and the friction and dragging and bumping would naturally cause soilure and abrasions. Distance was 136 feet. W. E. Thompson, whose booklet of 32 pages has been generously scattered, quote, from the Potomac to the Rio Grande, unquote, in the evident effort to reach all of his blood relations, who, as he tells us, are dissolutely distributed over the entire region between these two watercourses. W. E. Thompson says on page 18 of his rambling, incoherent pamphlet, "There is not a shadow of doubt that she was murdered in this basement on this dirty floor. The back door had been forced open by drawing the staple. This door opened out on an alley back of the building. There's every reason for believing that the murderer went out that door." Thompson argues that Jim Connolly, that is, the black janitor, did the evil work. But why did Jim Connolly have to draw the staple? That's a pin to keep the door shut, a large metal pin. But why did Jim Connolly have to draw the staple and leave the building by that door? Connolly, as the janitor, had the run of the entire building. He was in it on that fatal Saturday. He was there when the white ladies and girls left, and was gone in the usual way when Newt Lee came on duty for the evening as night watchman. The basement door was not then open, but the crime had already been committed, and the dead body lay there in the gloom. Whose interest would it serve to afterwards draw the staple and give the door the appearance of having been forced? When William J. Burns came to Atlanta last spring and began his campaign of thunder and earthquake, he definitely shouted to the public at every step he took. His very first whoop was that a careful examination of the facts in the case showed that the crime had been committed by, quote, "a degenerate of the lowest type," unquote. Burns roared the statement that the guilty man had never been suspected and was still, quote, "at large," unquote. Burns yelled that this unsuspected criminal of the lowest type was hiding out somewhere nearer to the North Pole than Atlanta, and with an ear-splitting noise, Burns set out to find that man. Burns said he was, quote, "utterly confident," unquote, he would find this man, who was expected to wait calmly until Burns could nab him. As everybody who reads the papers last summer knows, that was precisely the theory upon which Burns started to work. He went on a wild goose chase up into the northern states, leaving our fair state of Georgia, and was gone for months, working the Frank case. Working it how? Hunting for what? He didn't have to go north to find evidence against Jim Connolly. Every bit of evidence against Jim, the black janitor, was right there in Atlanta. Burns has never produced a single witness from up north. Not a scrap of testimony resulted from all his months of labor in the North. What was he doing there? From day to day and week to week, he put out interviews in which he declared he was making, quote, "the most gratifying progress," unquote. Progress? At what? Gratifying? How? My own idea was that Burns spent his time chasing around opulent Hebrews, and that his gratifying progress consisted in relieving the prosperous children of Israel of their superfluity of ducats. And by the way, the word ducats, editor's note, refers to the famous Shakespeare play, The Merchant of Venice, where the greedy Jewish villain is bemoaning the fact that he has lost his money, and he says he's lost his daughter and his money, and the currency of Venice at that time was called the ducat. He says, "Oh, my daughter, my ducats, my daughter, my ducats." One of the most famous lines, where it shows that he cares about his money as much as his daughter. So again, that little line from the very educated publisher, Thomas Watson, was, "My own idea is that Burns spent his time chasing around after opulent Hebrews, and that his gratifying progress consisted of relieving the prosperous children of Israel of their superfluity of ducats." It takes money to stimulate the activities of such a peculiar concern as the Burns Detective Agency. In one of his many interviews, published in the papers of Cain and Abel, a little Bible reference there, to Old Testament figures, this great detective, editor's note, I'm going to reread this. It's one of the most amazing Freudian slips which has ever been made. This is a private detective talking about private detectives, and he blurts out, "The private detective is one of the most dangerous criminals that we have to contend with." Returning to Watson, "I considered that the superbest piece of cool effrontery that a Gentile ever uttered, and a Jew ever printed. You couldn't beat it if you sat up all night and drank inspiration from the nectar Jupiter sips. Week after week, Burns pursued the pleasures of the chase, up north, presumably bringing down many a fat Hebrew, and not only got a magnificent bag of rich Jews, but with the unholy appetite of an Egyptian turning the tables on the chosen people, he spoiled them to such an extent that it was a battue." Editor's note, this hunting term from the French means the beating of woods and bushes to flush game, unquote. So he says that what he was doing was a battue. He was flushing the money out of these rich Jews up north by claiming he was going to find somebody else and pin the blame on that person for Leo Frank's crime, and he was going to get Leo Frank off. So he's basically saying Burns is a cynical operator who was ripping the Jews off. Okay, back to Watson. "Having bled these opulent Hebrews of the North until they were pale about the gills and mangled in their bank books, William J. came roaring back southward, oozing newspaper interviews at every stop of the train cars. Burns said he had his report all about ready. That report was going to create a seismic upheaval. That report would astound all right-thinking bipeds and demonstrate what a set of imbeciles with the Atlanta police, the Atlanta detectives, the Pinkerton detectives, the Solicitor General, the jury, the Supreme Court of Georgia in the United States, and those prejudiced, bigoted mortals who had believed Leo Frank to be the murderer of Mary Fagan." Editor's note, now I'm putting in a little bit of more lengthy explanatory comments on this part of the Thomas Watson article. First, I show a logo of the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, founded in 1850 by Allan Pinkerton. It was the first secret service and provided bodyguards to factory and mine owners, goons to break up unions, and it provided union infiltrators as well. They also had private detectives if you wanted to find out if your husband was cheating on you with another woman, or to find out try to figure out if the bookkeeper was stealing money from the company till, and so forth. It was a huge private detective agency, and it still is today. Ironically, it merged with its hated rival, the William Burns Agency, in the year 2003 to form a new company called Securitas, which is Latin for security. Interestingly, Leo Frank himself, with all his money from the Atlanta and New York Jewish communities, hired 2 Pinkerton detectives, along with agents from the rival Burns Detective Agency, to help him prove his innocence. Although all the detectives later, quote, publicly expressed their confidence that Frank was guilty beyond any question, unquote. The source of that is the respected Jewish author Albert S. Lindemann in his book, The Jew Accused, Three Anti-Semitic Affairs, Dreyfus, Baylis, and Frank, 1894 to 1915. And this is by the very prestigious Cambridge University Press in England, 1991. And this quote is found on page 249. And so I want to repeat what this is. I found this in Wikipedia, and I looked it up. It's true. Both teams of detectives hired by Leo Frank, the William J. Burns Agency, and the Pinkerton Detective Agency, after the trial was over and Leo Frank had been lynched, publicly expressed their confidence that Frank was guilty beyond any question. People who had interviewed Frank, investigated the case, and had worked for Leo Frank after he died, there was no more money to be made, actually said that, yeah, I thought he was guilty. And again, the person writing this is Albert S. Lindemann, graduate of Harvard in 1968. He is professor emeritus, in other words, he's retired, professor emeritus of history at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And I have a picture of this Jewish gentleman who's very intelligent looking. I also add, as it turns out, William J. Burns seemingly wanted to bilk money from the Hebrew cash cows even after the U.S. Supreme Court in the late spring of 1915 had refused to even hear the appeal of the Frank case. Here, a letter which is printed out, scanned in and printed on this blog of mine, Burns arrogantly addressed the doomed as "my dear Leo." The new angle, as alluded to at the end of the letter, was a strident letter-writing campaign to bombard Georgia Governor John Slayton with demands that he commute Frank's death sentence to life in prison, whereupon a new trial with a new jury, a new judge, and new witnesses would be sought. Okay, and here's the letter from the William J. Burns International Detective Agency from April 29, 1915. And this is after the U.S. Supreme Court had refused to even hear the appeal of Leo Frank. And this is with the top lawyers in America. These were lawyers that these Supreme Court justices knew. They knew they weren't flakes, and they just wouldn't even hear it. I mean, it was obvious Leo Frank was guilty. Okay. And this is, it says, written in pencil, confidential. Okay, it's addressed to Leo M. Frank, Esquire, 39 Forsyth Street, Atlanta, Georgia. My dear Leo, I have just reached New York from San Francisco today and hasten to write you extending my deepest sympathy and regrets over the failure of the Supreme Court of the United States to give you the relief that you're entitled to. It is very difficult for me to talk or write about your case without losing my temper, but I want to assure you that of the thousands of people that I have met everywhere, during my speeches and otherwise. And again, so Burns was not looking for the real killer, no more than O.J. Simpson was looking for the real killer after he got off in his murder case. He was giving speeches to groups of Jews and gullible Goyim, gullible white people, gullible Gentiles, about how Georgia was a terrible state and everybody should write letters and exert pressure on the governor of Georgia to not let Leo Frank be hanged. So he's giving speeches. He's not investigating, he's giving speeches. And that's what he says here. He says, I want to assure you that of the thousands of people that I have met everywhere during my speeches and otherwise, I have not yet found a single individual who has not expressed themselves in the strongest terms concerning your innocence. And even those who have not understood the case, when I got to explaining it, were strong in their denunciation of those responsible for your predicament. While at San Francisco, I spoke at Dr. Aked's church, who you probably know of through his reputation, to over 2,000 people, and gave a complete history of your case. And I was told by many of those present that it was the clearest exposition they had ever heard of it, and they were all strongly moved. Among those present was Mr. Harris Weinstock, who you will remember as a member of the United States Commission on Industrial Relations, and after listening to my speech went home and wrote 25 letters to 25 of the most prominent men in the United States, urging them as a personal favor to him to immediately write Governor Slayton and telling them that he was prepared, blah, blah, blah. And the letter continues. Explaining this a little bit further, John M. Slayton had been a very respected and popular governor of Georgia, and many said he was a presidential material. That is, until he suddenly, under pressure, commuted the sentence of Leo Frank, who was a client of his own law firm. He had been a lawyer before he became governor, and one of his law partners was in charge of the Leo Frank case. So he commuted the sentence of a client of his own law firm, upon which Governor Slayton had to flee his own state of Georgia, and he and his wife did not return for 11 years. In fact, they went out to California, to the other coast. He was a very distinguished, handsome-looking man, but he certainly disgraced himself, and he probably would have been lynched too had he stayed in Georgia. I have a picture also of a wonderful book called The Murder of Little Mary Phagan, the true story by Mary Phagan Keene. This is the great niece of Mary Phagan. Looks quite a bit like her, too. It's eerie how closely they resemble each other. And I write, Mary Phagan Keene, the great niece of the victim, wrote this astoundingly fair and accurate book about the case, which also contains some of the most touching descriptions ever of the victim and her personality. Mary's fate, and then the attempts to get her murderer off, outraged Georgians so much because Mary sincerely incarnated everything that was noble, gracious, and pure about Southern girl and womanhood. Her relatives would choke up even decades later in their overwhelming, continuing grief if asked to speak of her and what she was like. So that's one of the great side benefits of this book, is that Mary Phagan Keene was a relative, and she was able to speak to her grandparents and to these old folks that were people who had actually known Mary, her great aunt, and they were just, breaking down in tears 30 years later. What a beautiful, sweet, innocent and girl, and brave. I mean, other girls had succumbed to the sexual pressure, threats of being fired by Leo Frank, but this girl had fought tooth and nail against having sex forced on her, so she was a little heroine. I also have a picture here of an arrogant Leo Frank at age 9. He was just 4 years younger than Mary, who was 13 when he killed her, when he was 35. Young Frank was a pupil at the Pratt School in Brooklyn, New York, which later, ironically, an art student named George Lincoln Rockwell would attend, the most famous American anti-Semite of our times. Now, returning to the Thomas Watson article. Naturally, the public held its breath as it waited for the publication of this much advertised report by Mr. Burns. At last it came. And what was it? To the utter amazement of everybody, it consisted of an argument by Burns on the facts that were already of record. He did not offer a shred of new evidence. His only attempt at new testimony was the bought affidavit of the Reverend C.B. Ragsdale, who swore that he overheard Conley tell another Negro that he had killed a girl at the National Pencil Factory. Okay, editor's note on this. Reverend C.B. Ragsdale was a minister in a black church in Atlanta that Conley sometimes attended. He took money to sign an affidavit stating that he had overheard that another black person in his congregation had confided in him, that Conley had confided in him that he'd killed a girl in the National Pencil Factory. All right, well, I have to say, to Reverend C.B. Ragsdale's credit, as a man of God, he felt guilty and angry. I mean, first of all, he was letting this horrible Jew get out of the noose for the murder of this little white girl, and he was putting a noose in effect around the neck of his own parishioner and fellow black man, the janitor Jim Conley. But it would seem that the good reverend finally, probably after having a vision of hellfire, went public and said, no, I took money to sign that affidavit, and nobody in my parish told me that Jim Conley had admitted killing a girl at the pencil factory. So the only new testimony that Burns produced was a bought affidavit by Reverend Ragsdale, who then renounced what he had said. Okay, going back to Watson. So after all his work up in the north, and after all his bragging about what he would show in his report, Burns' bluff came to the pitiful showdown of a bribed witness who was paid to put the crime on the Negro. As Burns said, the private detective is the most dangerous criminal we have to contend with. We have indeed so found. Commenting upon the Conley articles, the Houston Texas Chronicle says editorially, Collier's Weekly has espoused Frank's case in its usual intense way, and has put the work of analyzing the facts into the hands of a man who does not mince words. And while one may not be willing to agree with all of its contentions, there is one point on which it hits the bullseye, that of the speech of the Solicitor General or prosecuting attorney. Now, in what manner had Collier's hit the bullseye? According to Collier's, the speech was, quote, venomously partisan, unquote. And the wish is editorially expressed that all lawyers in the United States could read it and let that paper know what they think of it. So presumably it was stenographically reported, and it may safely be assumed that Collier's quotes correctly. It says, the Roof case, the Rosenthal murder, and other crimes in which Jews played a part were dragged into the argument. Okay, what this refers to is that the prosecuting attorney, the solicitor, Hugh Dorsey, had brought up various cases where, like Jewish criminals, one Jewish gangster had killed another Jewish gangster. And he was making the point that just as not all white Christian people are good, and not all are bad, not all Jews are good, not all Jews are bad. He says, we're not talking about the Jews in this murder trial. We're talking about one specific person. Did he commit the murder or not? It has nothing to do with whether he's a Jew or a Gentile. He brought up the case to show that some Jews are bad. Some Jews are murderers. Some Jews are, in fact, gangsters. And that's the only point he was making, because Southerners, especially Bible-reading Southerners, were reading the Old Testament, and the stories of Moses and Noah and Isaiah and the prophets and so forth, and Bible prophecy. And many Southerners, until this crisis of the Leo Frank trial, had been actually very pro-Jewish. So what he was saying is, look, even in the Bible and in modern times, there have been plenty of bad Jewish people. But he was definitely not saying all Jews are evil. Returning to Watson. Elevating himself to the pinnacle of moral rectitude, the editor of the Chronicle says, in England, where trials are conducted more narrowly along proper lines than they are anywhere else in the world, a Crown's counsel who would make a denunciatory or emotional appeal to a jury would be adjudged in contempt. With such a speech and a crowd which had already prejudged the case filling the courthouse, a fair trial in the meaning of our Constitution and the law was impossible. Okay, going back to Watson. In England it would have been different, says the Chronicle. Yes, it would. In England, Leo Frank would long since have gone the way of Dr. Crippen and suffered for his terrible crime. Well, Dr. Crippen was actually an American citizen who had murdered his wife in London, and he had been then escaped to Canada. He'd been arrested, brought back to England. This American citizen tried, convicted, sentenced to death, and hanged quickly. So, since the Houston Chronicle is praising English jurisprudence, well, there's a very famous case around this time, 100 years ago, when Watson was writing of Dr. Crippen, and he hadn't spent 2 years appealing and going up to the Supreme Court of England or anything. Bam, he was found guilty and he was hanged. So that completely deflated the claim of the Houston Chronicle that the English system was so much, more merciful and more sympathetic and whatnot. Okay, returning to Watson. But was Dorsey's speech such a venomous tirade? Was he in contempt of court in his allusions to Roof and Hummel and Rosenthal, that is, to these Jewish gangsters? Did Dorsey bring the race issue into the case? Okay, when Dorsey, what this word race issue means, as an editorial comment, people use the word race more often. They would even speak of like the German race or the Anglo-Saxon race or the Jewish race, meaning a genetic line of people or a group of people who intermarry with each other and so forth. So today we just say white race, black race, Asians and whatnot. But the word race could be used to refer to the Jews at that point, or to even Italians, the Italian race, you could say, because most Italians back then would intermarry only with their own kind. So, return to Watson. Solicitor General Hugh M. Dorsey's speech was stenographically reported. It makes a booklet of 146 pages. On pages 2, 3, and 4, Mr. Dorsey deals with the race issue, that is, the Jewish issue, and deplores the fact that, quote, the defense first mentioned race, unquote. Mr. Dorsey says, not a word emanated from this side, not a word indicating any feeling against any human being for being black or white, Jew or Gentile. But the first time it was ever brought into this case, and it was brought in for a purpose, and I've never seen two men manifest more delight or exultation than Messrs. Rosser and Arnold, that is the lawyers for Leo Frank, when they put the question to George Kendley at the 11th hour. Quote, a thing which they'd expected us to do, and which the state did not do, because we didn't feel it, and it wasn't in this case. This is Dorsey speaking here. He's saying he expected the Frank lawyers to expect them to bring up the Jewish question, this nasty Jew. But they didn't. It would have been a mistake. It had nothing to do with Jewishness. I mean, she wasn't murdered in the synagogue. She wasn't Jewish. It was simply a crime. And, white Christians also rape and kill little girls. And so do blacks, and so do Chinese, and so forth. So it really wasn't. What was Jewish was how they tried to get this murderer off. Is how the big Jews in New York rushed down to get an obvious murderer off. That was what was Jewish. Going back to the remarks of Hugh Dorsey, I will never forget how they seized it, that is the Jewish question, seized with avidity the suggestion, and you know how they have harped on it ever since. Now mark you, they are the ones that mentioned it, not us. The word never escaped our mouth, unquote. So there sat Frank's lawyers, two of the most aggressive legal fighters, men who rose to their feet again and again during the course of Dorsey's speech to the jury to deny his statements and interject their own. But they did not utter a word of denial when he charged them to their teeth in open court with bringing into the case the evidence that Frank is a Jew. Nor did they challenge his statement that they had laid for him to do it. In other words, they were waiting for that moment when Dorsey would bring up the Jewish aspect. And they had done it themselves when they saw he did not mean to give them that string to harp on. In other words, once Leo Frank's dream team of aggressive, highly paid lawyers saw that Dorsey was not falling into the trap of bringing up the Jewish issue, they brought up the Jewish issue because they wanted to scream anti-Semitism. Returning to Watson, having made his explanation of how the fact of Frank being a Jew got into the case, Dorsey paid this glowing tribute to the great race from which this degenerate and pervert sprung. Okay, so Watson is actually, at this point, like many other people in Georgia, has become quite anti-Jewish. But in this article, he is saying the kind of things that Hugh Dorsey was saying, like, oh, we know there are many wonderful Jews and they've contributed so much and blah, blah, blah. So Dorsey was very carefully covering himself by now saying nice things about the Jews. And that's what this next paragraph is about. In other words, Dorsey was not trying to inflame any anti-Semitism in the jury. He was talking about the facts of the case. Okay, now here's a quote from Dorsey. And this is in his summation to the jury, which absolutely knocked the baseball out of the park and absolutely got Leo Frank convicted of murder, and then he got the death penalty, and he finally suffered the death penalty 2 years later. So this was part of the summation to the jury by the district attorney, the Solicitor General, Hugh Dorsey. I say to you here and now that the race, meaning the Jews, from which that man comes is as good as our race. His ancestors were civilized when ours were cutting each other up and eating human flesh. Editors know it's a ridiculous statement, but anyways, that's how people believed the Jews were advanced when our ancestors were barbarians. Okay. His race is just as good as ours, just so good, but no better. I honor the race that has produced Disraeli, the greatest prime minister that England has ever produced. I honor the race that produced Judah P. Benjamin, as great a lawyer as ever lived in America or England, because he lived in both places and won renown in both places. Okay, and what that is a reference to, as an editorial note, Judah P. Benjamin was the treasurer of the Confederacy, in the Civil War. He was a very powerful Jew in the Confederate government. In fact, many Jews were pro-slavery, many Jews were involved in the slave trade, many Jews were involved in actually bringing black Africans, Negroes from Africa, originally in the 1700s to America, and made a lot of money off it. So Southerners actually white Christian Southerners saw Jews as being pro-slavery, pro-South, and the fact that Judah P. Benjamin was the treasurer, in other words, the money man who was in charge of all the money of the Confederacy during the Civil War, the war between the states, as is called more correctly by Southerners. They saw that as proof that there's no conflict between the South and the Jews. So Hugh Dorsey's bringing up Judah P. Benjamin to say, oh, what a great Southerner he was. Okay. Dorsey continues, I honor the Strauss brothers, Oscar the diplomat, and the man who went down with his wife by his side on the Titanic. And that was a famous case where one of the Strausses of the Macy's department store fame, the husband and wife died together on the Titanic. The wife could have been evacuated in the lifeboat, but she decided to die with her husband as the Titanic went down. And everybody thought it was so admirable and romantic, and it showed that some Jews are really great people. Okay, so this is very famous, of course, 100 years ago, the sinking of the Titanic. Okay, quote, now Dorsey again speaking on a personal note. I roomed with one of his race at college. One of his race is my partner. I served with old man Joe Hirsch on the board of trustees of the Grady Hospital. I know Rabbi Marks, but to honor him. And I knew Dr. Son of the Hebrew Orphans Home, and I have listened to him with pleasure and pride. But on the other hand, when Becker wished to put to death his bitter enemy, this is a famous murder case, it was men of Frank's race he selected. In other words, this person hired some Jewish hitmen to kill one of his enemies. Abe Hummel, the lawyer who went to the penitentiary in New York, this is a very famous Jewish lawyer for criminals. If you were a criminal, murderer, rapist, whatever, he would represent you. And actually, Abe Hummel was involved in certain crimes himself, getting rich Gentile Christian men involved with loose women, and then blackmailing those men. And they'd have to pay him hush money monthly, or he'd go to their wives. So he's referring now to the very infamous, disgusting lawyer called Abe Hummel. Abe Hummel, the lawyer who went to the penitentiary in New York, and Abe Roof, who went to the penitentiary in San Francisco. Schwartz, the man accused of stabbing a girl in New York, who committed suicide, and others that I could mention, show that this great people are amendable to the same laws as you and I and the black race. They rise to heights sublime, but they also sink to the depths of degradation. Unquote. After Rosser and Arnold had dragged the Jewish name into the case, could Dorsey have handled it more creditably to himself and to those Jews who believe with Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that crime must be punished? Read again what Dorsey actually said, as stenographically reported. And remember that Connolly pretended to have read it before he wrote his articles. And then sift your mind and see how much respect you have for a writer who tries to deceive the public in that unscrupulous manner. C.P. Connolly makes two statements about the law of Georgia. On December 14, 1915, he stated in Collier's magazine that, quote, by a constitutional amendment adopted in 1906, the Supreme Court of Georgia cannot reverse a case on other than errors of law. Close quote. This remarkable statement he varies somewhat in his article published December 19, 1915. Watson continues, under a constitutional amendment adopted in 1906, the Supreme Court of Georgia is not allowed to reverse any capital case, a murder case, where no error of law has been committed in the trial, no matter how weak the evidence may be, and cannot investigate or pass upon the question of guilt or evidence. What this refers, there's errors of law and errors of fact in my editorial note here. The question is, was the evidence flawed, or was simply the proper procedures not observed? That's the big question. Was the trial conducted correctly, or was the evidence correct? Those are two different questions. Did people follow the rule books of how to conduct a trial properly? That's one question. And was the evidence believable? That's another question. Watson continues, since the days of Magna Carta, it may be doubted whether any state set up under English principles could legally deprive reviewing courts of the right to annul a verdict which has no evidence to support it. In such a case, the question of evidence would become a question of law. Without due process of law, no citizen can be robbed of life, liberty, or property. While it is the province of the jury to say what has been proved, on issues of disputed facts, it is for the court to decide whether the record discloses jurisdictional facts. It necessarily follows that if a record shows that no crime has been committed, or if committed, the evidence failed to connect the defendant with it, the verdict would have to be set aside as a matter of law. And what Watson is saying here is, I think people were more educated, they used better vocabulary 100 years ago than today. It's hard for modern people to follow this. What he's basically saying is that if it can be shown that the jury ignored valid evidence, then a court absolutely would overturn it. It's not just questions of procedures, but if invalid evidence was introduced, such as, for example, if Dorsey had said, hang this man, he's a Jew. That would be evidence. I mean, he was a Jew, but that would be irrelevant evidence. So definitely a court would also look at the question of the evidence, whether it was relevant to the case. Returning to Watson. The constitutional amendment of 1906, to which Connolly refers, had for its main purpose the creation of a court of appeals as an auxiliary and a relief to the Supreme Court of Georgia. In doing this, the legislature had to divide appealed cases between the two courts. The new law provided that the Supreme Court should review and decide those civil cases which went up from the superior courts and from the courts of ordinary, our chancery courts, and, quote, all cases of conviction of a capital felony, unquote. In other words, murder. To the Court of Appeals was assigned those cases going up from city courts and all convictions in criminal cases less than a capital felony, less than murder. The Supreme Court of Georgia, in every open case of motion for a new trial, is now constantly passing upon the sufficiency of the evidence that to support the verdict. and the court passed upon that very question in Frank's first motion for a new trial. I cannot imagine anything that would cause a more universal wave of protest than an effort to emasculate our Supreme Court by robbing it of the time-honored authority to review all the evidence in contested cases. And parenthetically, especially in a murder case where a man's on trial for his life and he's facing the gallows. Continuing with Watson, and to decide in the calm atmosphere of the consulting room, remote from personalities, passions, and the dust of forensic battle, whether the evidence set out in the record is sufficient to support the verdict. If Connolly's idea of the change made in 1906 were correct, it would lead to the preposterous proposition that the Supreme Court might have before it a case of a man condemned to death for rape, when evidence showed that there had been no penetration. The court would have to let the man die, because the judge below had committed no error of law. In other words, no error of procedure. In other words, the court had convened on time, witnesses had been heard on both sides, the jury was given instructions, there were enough people in the jury. In other words, procedure. Would it not be the greatest of errors of law to allow a citizen to be hanged when there is no proof of a crime? Would it be due process of law to kill a man under legal forms without evidence of his guilt? Those men who allege that Connolly is a lawyer also allege that Burns is a detective. Both statements cut a large and weird figure in the realm of cheap, ephemeral fiction. If being a lawyer were a capital offense, and Connolly were arraigned for the crime, the jury would not only acquit him without leaving the box, but would find a unanimous verdict of malicious prosecution. In other words, he's saying Connolly is incompetent as a lawyer, or simply a liar. If being a detective were virulent, confluent smallpox, the wildest advocate of compulsory vaccination would never pester Burns. It is as much as Burns can do to find an umbrella in a hall hat rack. A prodigious noise has been made over the alleged statement of Judge L.S. Roane, who presided at Frank's trial, that he did not know whether Frank was guilty or innocent. All of that talk is mere bosh. What Judge Roane said was exactly what the law contemplates that he shall say. The law of Georgia constitutes the trial judge an impartial arbiter, whose jury is to pass on to the jury, in a legal manner, the evidence upon which the jury are to act as judges. They're not only the judges of the evidence, but the sole judges of it. The slightest expression of an opinion from the bench as to what has or has not been proven works a forfeiture of the entire proceeding. In other words, in no other way can a defendant be tried constitutionally by his peers than by clothing the 12 jurors, whom he in part selects as his peers, with full power to adjudge the facts. And Watson writes in parentheses, I'm confident it is the intent of the law to also make these peers of the accused, in other words, the jury, the full judges of the law, to exactly the same extent that they are absolute judges of the facts. But that is a question not germane to the Frank case. Here he's talking about the concept of jury nullification, and that juries would have the right to say, this is an unfair law, an outrageous law, and so forth. But he's not going further into that question. He's saying the judges of the evidence is the jury. The judge isn't supposed to have an opinion about the innocence or guilt of the accused. That's the jury's job to decide whether he's innocent or guilty. Okay, continue with Watson. Now, if Connolly and Collier's magazine had taken the pains to examine our law, they would have realized that the legal intendment of Judge Roane's declaration was no more than this. Quote, it is not for me to say whether this man is innocent or guilty. That is for the jury. They have said that he is guilty, and I find that the evidence sustains the verdict. Therefore, I refuse to grant the motion for a new trial. Unquote. In 99 cases out of 100, our judges utter some such words as those in charging the jury and in passing upon motions for new trial. I will say further that a lack of definite opinion as to the guilt or innocence of the defendant at the bar is an ideal state of mind for the presiding judge. We are all so human that if a judge feels certain of the guilt or innocence of the accused, he will leg for one side or the other. So well is this understood that the trial judge almost invariably takes pains to say to the jury, quote, "Gentlemen, the court does not mean to say or to intimate what has or has not been proven. That is peculiarly your province. It is for you to say, under the law as I have given it to you, whether the evidence establishes the defendant's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." Unquote. There isn't a lawyer in Georgia who hasn't heard that kind of thing, times without number. If Judge Ellis Roane did indeed keep his mind so far above the jury function in this case that he did not form an opinion either way, he maintained that ideal neutrality and impartiality which the law expects of the perfect judge. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch is another paper which has taken jurisdiction of the Frank case. It employs another famous detective for the defense, a New York person named George Dougherty. Every detective who favors Frank is a famous detective, a scholar, a gentleman, a deep thinker, and a model citizen, just as Frank is. These detectives and police officers who testify the other way are bad men, the scum of the earth, crooks, rapscallions, liars, and polecats. Polecat is a southern word for skunk. The famous detective, George Dougherty, appears to have studied the case horridly, however. He says, "And the office in which Frank was charged with having committed immoral attacks," in other words, his office at the pencil factory, that refers to Frank having sex with his own factory girls or bringing prostitutes up for sex right in his office, which is something to which the Negro janitor, the black janitor, Jim Conley, testified in graphic detail. Okay, so that's what that's about. Repeating. And the office in which Frank was charged with having committed immoral attacks was in direct line of possible observation from several people already in the building, whose approach Conley would have known nothing of. Unquote. George D. is mistaken. Frank and the other man took the women to a place where they were not, quote, in direct line of possible observation, unquote. The famous detective again says, another point. Conley's statement is that Frank knew in advance that Mary Fagan was to visit the factory that day for the purpose of getting her pay. There is no reasonable cause for believing this to have been true. No other employee went there that day to be paid. If Frank did not know that Mary Fagan was to be there, Conley's entire story fails. As a matter of fact, there seems to be more reason to believe that he did not than there is reason to believe that he did. Unquote. Now, what will you think of this famous detective when I tell you that page 26 of the official court record of this case shows that Montine Stover swore she went there to get the wages due her on that Saturday and was at the office of Frank at the fatal half hour during which he cannot give an account of his whereabouts. And this is what editor's note, what I referred to earlier. She went in to get her pay, and bizarrely, the office was empty. Frank was gone because he was busy raping and killing Mary Fagan, and then getting the Negro janitor and dragging her body to the basement, where he then asked the janitor to throw the body into the furnace and burn it up. So that's why Leo Frank was not in the office. Montine Stover went to get her pay. The office was empty. The boss's office was empty, door wide open. Okay, going back to Watson. George Dougherty does not even know that Frank, in his statement to the jury, I repeat, Frank, in his statement to the jury, stated that Miss Mattie Smith came for her pay envelope that Saturday morning, and also for the wages due her sister-in-law, and that he gave to the fathers of 2 boys the pay envelopes for their sons. This makes 5 other employees, 2 in person and 3 by proxy, who were there for the wages due them on the identical day when Mary Fagan went for her pay, and then disappeared. The very day when Dougherty asserts, quote, no other employees went there that day to be paid. See Frank's statement, page 179. Is it any marvel that the public has been bamboozled and the state of Georgia made the object of condemnation when famous detectives write such absurdities and respectable papers publish them? The state of Georgia has no press agent, no publicity bureau, no regiment of famous detectives, no brigade of journalistic Hessians. The state can only maintain an attitude of dignified endurance, while this mercenary, made-to-order hurricane of fable, misrepresentation, and abuse passes over her head. All she asks of an intelligent, fair-minded public is to judge her by the official record, as agreed on by the attorneys for both sides. Little side note here. At the end of a trial, both sides, the prosecution and the defense, go over the stenographic record of what everybody said during the trial. The witnesses, the prosecution, the defense lawyers, the defendant, and so forth. And then they both sign a document stating, okay, this is word for word correct. This is what everybody actually said. Okay, so I repeat the statement by Watson. All she asks of an intelligent, fair-minded public is to judge her by the official record as agreed on by the attorneys for both sides. All that she expects from outsiders is the reasonable presumption that she is not worse than other states, not worse than Missouri, which tried the boodlers of St. Louis, not worse than California, which tried the grafters and the dynamiters, not worse than Virginia, which tried and executed McHugh, Beatty, and Cluverius, on much less evidence than there is against Frank. The New York World, owned by the Pulitzers, which is a famous Jewish publishing family, hence the name Pulitzer Prize, said in its report of the case, May 24, on evidence of Connally, Frank was indicted for murder. July 28, trial of Frank began. August 24, Connally testified Frank entrapped the girl in his office, beat her unconscious, then strangled her. August 25, jury found Frank guilty of murder, first degree. Quote, on evidence of Connally, unquote, Frank was indicted and convicted according to the Pulitzers. Of course, the general public does not know that Frank could not have been convicted upon the evidence of Connally, a confessed accomplice. Okay, what this refers to is that Leo Frank then ordered his employee, the black janitor, to help him get rid of the body. Jim Connally was then terrified that if he did not do as he was told, besides, of course, being fired and losing his job, or maybe being murdered by Leo Frank, who, of course, was frantic to do something about the body. He hadn't intended to murder Mary Fragan, just rape her, as he'd done with other girls. But now Frank was obviously very worked up and very nervous. So Jim Connally was afraid of his boss, is afraid he'd be murdered by his boss, afraid he'd be fired if he didn't obey. Jim Connally was also afraid that Leo Frank would do what he did intend, ultimately end up doing, which is accuse the black man of the rape and murder. So he was thinking, I better stay on Mr. Frank's good side here and just do what he says and then, get away from him and think what I'm going to do next. But he did not want to make an instant enemy out of his boss, and he just wasn't sure what to do. So he helped him take the body down to the basement. And that made, of course, Connally an accomplice. So I'll repeat the first sentence here. On evidence of Connally, Frank was indicted and convicted according to the Pulitzers. Of course, the general public does not know that Frank could not have been convicted upon the evidence of Connally, a confessed accomplice under Georgia law. The general public, which includes such lawyers as Connally, cannot be supposed to know that the law does not allow any defendant to be convicted upon the evidence of his accomplice. Because when, like, two gangsters and one testifies against the other, in Georgia, it's meaningless because obviously the one gangster will blame the other gangster for the murder or the rape or the theft or whatever, because his motive is to get off himself by blaming his buddy. So Georgia law at that time did not allow an accomplice to blame the other crook. You couldn't be convicted based on that because, nobody would believe the other crook, and he just wants to save his own neck. Okay, back to Watson. In the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, which I believe is also a Pulitzer paper, and again, Pulitzer was a Jewish publisher, there are two recent letters by William Preston Hill, M.D., Ph.D., which the state of Georgia is violently arraigned. William Preston Hill, M.D., Ph.D., starts out by stating that, quote, anybody who has carefully read the proceedings in the murder trial of Leo Frank must be convinced the whole trial was a disgraceful display of prejudice and fanatical unfairness. This whole proceeding is a disgrace to the state of Georgia and will bring on her the just contempt of the whole civilized world. Everywhere thoughtful men will judge Georgia to be filled with semi-barbarous, fanatical people of low mentality and strong, ill-controlled passions, a race to be avoided by anybody who cares for liberty, order, or justice. Then to show what a thoughtful man is William Preston Hill, M.D., Ph.D., now carefully he has read the record in the case, he proceeds to state that, quote, Frank was convicted on the unsupported evidence of a dissolute Negro of bad character, unquote, who was contradicted in 22 different instances. Then Mr. William Preston Hill, M.D., Ph.D., gives himself away by advising people to study the case. But how? By an examination of the record that went up to the Supreme Court? Oh, no. Study it by the paid newspaper columns of C.P. Connolly, who got his ideas of the case from the rascally and mendacious poseur William J. Burns. In the Chicago Sunday Tribune of March 27, 1914, appears a full-page article beginning, quote, Will the state of Georgia send an innocent man to the gallows? Unquote. The writer of the article is Burton Rasco. The entire article proceeds upon the idea that poor little Mary Fagin was a lewd girl, that she had been immorally intimate with two employees of the factory, that Jim Connolly, drunk and hard up, wanted her pay envelope, that he seized her to rob her, that he heard someone calling him, and he killed her. Mr. Rasco says that ordinarily juries are instructed that they are to assume the defendant is innocent until he is proven guilty, but that in Frank's case it was just the opposite. Mr. Rasco says that during the trial, men stood up in the audience and shouted to the jury, You better hang the Jew. If you don't, we'll hang him and get you too. Unquote. Now, the Chicago Tribune claims to be, quote, the world's greatest newspaper, unquote, with a circulation of 500,000 for its Sunday edition. It is therefore reasonable to suppose that at least 2 million people will get their ideas of the case from this special article, in which the public is told that Judge Roan allowed the audience to intimidate the jury by shouting their threats to the jury while the trial was in progress. Of course, anyone who will stop and think a moment will realize what an arrant falsehood that is. Had any such thing occurred, the able, watchful, indefatigable lawyers who had been fighting nearly 2 years to save Frank's life would have immediately moved for a mistrial and gotten it. No such incident has ever occurred in a Georgia courtroom, and no white man in Georgia was ever convicted on the evidence of a Negro. As a specimen of the misrepresentations which are misleading so many good people, take this extract from the article in the Chicago Tribune. It has been declared by Burns, among others, that the circumstantial evidence warranting the retention of Conley as the suspected slayer was dropped, and that Conley, that is the black janitor, was led to shoulder the blame upon Frank in somewhat the following manner. What do you know about this murder? In other words, the cops say this. Nothing. Who did you think did it? I don't know. How about Frank? Yes, I confess, he's the one who did it. Sure he was. That's the fellow we want. And forthwith, Frank was locked up as a suspect. In the statements of Mr. Rasco, like those of C.P. Connolly, these are rehashes from William J. Burns. Does not the Chicago Tribune know that Burns was expelled from the National Association of Police Chiefs? Does not the Tribune know that Burns's confidential man in this Frank case, Lahan, was expelled from the Chicago police force for blackmailing a woman of the town? Does not the Tribune know that the detectives bribed Reverend Ragsdale and Barber, the preacher and the deacon, to swear this crime onto the Negro Jim Connolly? Does not the Chicago Tribune know that the official records in the U.S. Department of Justice disclose the fact that Attorney General Wickersham and President William Howard Taft set aside some convictions in the Oregon land cases upon the overwhelming evidence that William J. Burns is a crook and corruptly obtained these convictions? As already stated in this magazine, that is in Watson's magazine, Connolly's evidence is not at all necessary to the conviction of Leo Frank. Eliminate the Negro entirely, and you have a dead solid case against this lewd young man who had been pursuing the girl for nearly 2 months, and who, after setting a trap for her on Memorial Day 1913, that is Confederate Memorial Day, was to be a parade in honor of the Confederate veterans and so forth. So that was Confederate Memorial Day 1913. Had to use such violence to overcome her struggle for her virtue that he killed her, and then had the diabolical cruelty to attack her character after she was dead. Mr. Luther Z. Rosser telegraphed to a northern newspaper a long statement in which he says, quote, Leo M. Frank is an educated, intelligent, normal man of a retiring, homemaking, home-loving nature. He's lived a clean, honest, busy, unostentatious life, known by few outside of his own people. In the absence of the testimony of the Negro, Jim Connolly, a verdict of acquittal would have been inevitable. Unquote. Now, if Mr. Rosser believed that Leo Frank was the pure young man and model husband, why did he sit silent while so many white girls and ladies swore under oath on the witness stand to Frank's lascivious character? Do you suppose that any power on earth could have produced 20 white women of Atlanta who would have sworn that Dr. John E. White's character is lascivious? Or that Judge Beverly Evans' character is lascivious? Or that Governor Slayton's character is lascivious? The ex-lawyer from Montana, C.P. Connolly, says in Collier's magazine, quote, the state contended that Frank murdered Mary Fagan on the second floor of the pencil factory. There were found 4 corpuscles of, quote, blood, unquote, a mere iota, on the second floor. The girl was brutally handled and bled freely, not only from the wound in her head, but from other parts of her body. Quote, 4 corpuscles of blood, a mere iota, on the second floor, unquote. That is what Connolly says. But what says the official record? On page 26, Mr. R.P. Barrett, the machinist for Frank's factory, testifies that on Monday morning early, that is, after the crime which had occurred previously on Saturday, he discovered the blood spots, which were not there the Friday before. He says, quote, the spot was about 4 or 5 inches in diameter, and little spots beyond these in the rear, 6 or 8 in number. It was blood, unquote. Here we have one of Frank's responsible employees swearing positively to a 5-inch splotch of blood with 6 or 8 smaller spots leading up to the main spot, as large as the lid of the average dinner pail. And Connolly tells the public that 4 corpuscles, a mere iota, were all that were found. When a man makes public statements of that kind, after having gone to Atlanta ostensibly to study the record, is he honestly trying to inform the public, or is he dishonestly trying to deceive it? Mel Stanford swore, these blood spots were right in front of the ladies' dressing room, unquote, where Connolly said he dropped the body of the girl after Frank called on him for help. Mrs. George Jefferson, also a worker in Frank's place, swore that they found the blood spots as big as a fan. Mrs. Jefferson had been working there for 5 years. She knew paint spots when she saw them, and told of the maroon, red, and red lime, and bright red, but she added, in answer to Frank's attorney, the spot I saw was not from one of those 3 paints. She swore that the spot was not there Friday, April 25th. They found it Monday morning at about 6 or 7 o'clock in the morning. We saw blood on the second floor in front of the girls' dressing room. It was about as big as a fan. The foreman of the metal room, Lemmy Quinn, also testified to seeing the blood spots. Monday morning, Quinn was Frank's own witness. J.D. Starnes, police officer, testified on page 10 of the official record, Mr. Connolly, that he saw the, quote, splotches of blood, unquote. I should judge the area of those splotches to be 1.5 feet. Captain Starnes saw the splotches of blood on Monday morning, April 28th, opposite the girls' dressing room, and they looked as if some white substance had been swept over them in the effort to hide them. Herbert Schiff, Leo Frank's assistant superintendent at the pencil factory, also swore to the blood spots. He saw them Monday morning. These witnesses are unimpeachable. 5 of them worked under Frank and were his trusted and experienced employees. They were corroborated by the doctors who examined the chips cut out of the floor. Those blood-stained chips are Exhibits E in the official record. Yet C.P. Connolly, sent down to Georgia to make an examination into actual facts, ignores the uncontradicted evidence and tells the great American public that on the second floor, where the state contends the crime was committed, there were found 4 corpuscles of blood, only a mere iota. Upon consulting an approved encyclopedia and dictionary, which was constructed for the use of just such semi-barbarians as we Georgians are, I find that the word corpuscle is synonymous with the word atom. Further research in the same encyclopedia leads me to the knowledge that an atom is such a very small thing that cannot be made any smaller. It is, you may say, the ultima thule of smallness. The point of a cambric needle is a large sphere of action compared to a corpuscle. The live animals that live in the water and sweet milk which you and I daily drink are whales, buffaloes, and Montana lawyers compared to a corpuscle. The germs, microbes, and malignant bacteria that swim around invisibly in so many harmless-looking liquids are behemoths, dragons, and Burns detectives compared to a corpuscle. The smallest conceivable thing, invisible to the naked eye, is what Connolly says they found on that second floor. And they not only found one of these infinitely invisible things, but 4. I want to deal nicely with Connolly, and therefore I will say that, as a lawyer and a journalist, I consider him a fairly good specimen of a corpuscle himself. What is he, as a teller and seller of the truth about the Frank case? I fear to say freely, lest the best government of the world should arrest me again for publishing disagreeable veracities. Pardon me for taking your time with one more exposure of the impudent falsehoods that are being published about the evidence on which Frank was convicted. In his elaborate article in the Kansas City Star, A.B. MacDonald says, quote, "The ashes and cinders were breathed in before she died in the cellar, while she was fighting off Connolly. In his drunken desperation, lest she be heard and he be discovered, he ripped a piece from her underskirt and tried to gag her with it. He was not strong enough. Then he grabbed the cord. The testimony proved that cords like that were in the cellar. He tied it tightly around her neck. It was proved at the trial that a piece of the strip of underskirt was beneath the cord, and beneath the strip of skirt were cinders. That proves beyond doubt that both were put on in the cellar. Having strangled her to death in eternal silence, the Negro had leisure to carry her back and hide her body at figure 12, where it was dark as midnight. Then he sat down to write the notes." Yes, the editor's note, for those who haven't heard the other audiobooks or read the other blogs that I've done about the Leo Frank case, or the items that have been published at leofrank.org. Leo Frank, after he raped and murdered this little girl, he ordered Jim Connolly to write some notes in what he thought was like good black dialect, Georgia dialect, implying that Newt Lee, the night watchman, had committed the crime. The notes are purportedly Mary Fagan, while being raped, writing and saying that the night watchman is doing this to me. Because, most women do get out a legal pad and start writing notes about who's raping them. during the act of being raped. And the notes are just left right there by the rapist. He doesn't, respect the final wishes of the deceased and leaves the note accusing him. So this was Leo Frank's crazy, insane scheme to frame the totally innocent night watchman Newt Lee by forcing another black employee, the black janitor Jim Conley, to write those notes in what Frank thought was appropriate black dialect. Okay, so that's the notes. I guess I'll repeat. This is what this A.B. McDonald of Kansas City is writing about, Conley was guilty, Conley did it. Conley, then he sat down to write the notes. Against the wall opposite the boiler was a small rude table with paper and pencil. Scattered around in the trash that came down from the floors above to be burned were sheets and pads of paper, exactly like those upon which the notes were written. The pad from which one of the notes was torn was found by the body by Police Sergeant L.S. Dobbs, who so testified. Here we have a graphic, gruesome picture of a fight between the girl and the Negro, down in the cellar. He overcomes her, and in her death struggles, she breathes her nose, mouth, and lungs full of ashes and cinders. The Negro tears off a strip of her clothing and binds it round her neck. He was not strong enough. Then he grabbed the cord. Okay, back to Watson here, analyzing this. In the next line, MacDonald tells you that the strip of clothing was so strong that it remained underneath the cord, and that beneath this strip were cinders. Quote, that proves beyond a doubt that they were both put on in the cellar, unquote. It is sufficient to say that the evidence of night watchman Newt Lee, of Atlanta Police Sergeant L.S. Dobbs, of Officer J.N. Starnes, and both the examining physicians, Drs. Hurt and Harris, totally negates the statement of MacDonald about the cinders under the girl's nails, the cinders packed into her face, and the cinders breathed into her nose, mouth, and lungs. There was nothing of the kind. MacDonald made all that up himself, aided by Conley's imagination and Burns' imbecility. See official record, pages 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and evidence of the doctors as per index. But let me ask you to fix your attention on the specific statement of MacDonald, that the cord pressed down upon the strip of clothing, one being under the other, and that the cinders were under this inner choke strip. Now turn to page 40 of the official record and see what Dr. Harris testified. He swore that she came to her death from, quote, this cord, unquote, which had been tied tight around her neck. He did not say a word about any strip of clothing around her neck, under the cord, nor a word about any cinders, ashes, or dust under the cord. Not one word. Turn to page 46 and read the testimony of Dr. J.W. Hurt. He said, quote, there was a cord round her neck, and this cord was embedded into the skin, unquote. Not a word about any strip of cloth under the cord, not a word about cinders, ashes, or dust under the cord, or on her neck. Sergeant Dobbs, after saying that, quote, the cord was around her neck, sunk into her flesh, unquote, added that she also had a piece of her underclothing around her neck. Quote, the cord was pulled tight and had cut into the flesh and tied just as tight as could be. The underclothing around her neck was not tight, unquote. Sergeant Dobbs, swearing that the cord had cut into the flesh, shows that there was no cushion of cloth to keep it from doing that very thing, namely cutting into her skin. Not a word did he say about cinders under her nails, under the cord, under the strip of underclothing, or in her mouth, nose, and lungs. In other words, the official record shows MacDonald's version of the evidence to be a reckless fabrication. Can you picture to yourself, in the sane recess of your own mind, a Southern Negro raping and killing a white girl, and then dragging her body back to a place where it was dark as midnight, and then, after all his terrific struggle with his victim, hunting around in the trash to find a pencil and some pads, 2 different colors, and seating himself leisurely, quote, at a small rude table near the boiler, unquote, to scribble a few lines of information to mankind as how he came to commit the crime. Can you picture to yourself a common Georgia Negro killing a white woman in that way, and then seating himself near her corpse, deep down in a dark cellar, to indulge in literary composition. Jim Conley, you see, and here Watson is being sarcastic, had not only murdered the girl down there below the surface, but was writing notes close to where the dead body lay, with the intention of carrying the notes out there to where it was dark as midnight to lay them by the dead girl's head. Then he meant to get so scared they would violently break out of the basement door into the alley rather than walk out as you will up the stairs. MacDonald doesn't know much about our southern... Okay, he uses the word niggers, so I'm just going to say that's what it says, niggers. He's just talking about very uneducated, probably illiterate, not all of them were, southern black people 100 years ago. So he uses the word niggers. MacDonald doesn't know much about southern niggers. That's the word he uses. But he understands us white folks. Just tell us any old ludicrous yarn and keep on telling it in the papers. And if nobody denies it, we will all believe it. There was not a scratch on the nose of the dead girl, yet all these reckless writers tell the public she was held face downward by her murderer, that her face was ground into the cinders to smother her screams. How could the nose escape bruises in such a frightful process, and how could she fail to have cinders and coal dust in her mouth and nose? There were none. In the Philadelphia Public Ledger, there's a copyrighted article by Waldo G. Morse, whose legend runs, Counselor, American Academy of Jurisprudence. Counselor Morse begins on the Frank case by asking a question and quoting himself in reply. Quote, "May a mob and a court scare away your lawyers? A sheriff will lock you away from the jury which convicts you, and may the sheriff then hold and hang you? Yes, say the Georgia courts, and so also says the United States District Judge in Georgia. Says the Supreme Court of the United States. We will hear arguments as to that. In the meantime, we will defer the hanging." Unquote. The fancy picture of a Georgia mob putting Rube Arnold, Luther Rosser, the Haas brothers, and the governor's own law firm to ignominious flight, and of the sheriff ruthlessly locking Frank away from the jury, and all this being done with the hearty approval of Judges Roan and Hill, the state Supreme Court, and federal Judge William Newman, is certainly a novel picture to adorn the classic walls of the American Academy of Jurisprudence. Counselor Morse proceeds as follows. "This is no mere question of a single life, but one for every man. Shall you be put on trial for your life or your liberty, and shall timid or careless lawyers lose, or dishonest lawyers barter away your rights? We wish for the honor of the bar, the dignity of the court, that the lawyers had stood their ground and had braved the mob, and that their client had joined in the defiance, inquiring from every juror face to face whether the verdict of guilty was the verdict of that individual juror. Such is due process of law." Okay, what they're referring to here in editorial comment is first, Leo Frank was not present for the reading of the jury's verdict. The reason why he was not, he did not have a legal right to be there for the reading of the verdict. I mean, he'd hear it from his lawyers. He'd hear it from the warden. There was concern that had Leo Frank been found innocent after this huge amount of Jewish pressure and media pressure and bribery and all the attacks upon Georgia, there was concern that a mob would go crazy if Leo Frank had been found innocent. And to prevent any possibility of violence against Leo Frank, the judge ordered that Leo Frank be kept in another part of the courthouse. So if a mob did form and Leo Frank were found innocent, this supposed theoretical mob could not attack him. So the purpose of Leo Frank not being in the courtroom for the verdict was to protect him. I mean, it's not as if they didn't tell him what the verdict was. The trial was over. There's no benefit to attending your own verdict. I mean, the trial's over. There's nothing more you can say at that point. Okay. The second point is they say, well, Leo Frank's lawyers did not ask each individual juror if they had voted guilty. This is a foolish technicality. If they had wanted to, they could have asked, but they didn't. This is an invented technicality. Furthermore, all juries in a felony case must unanimously rule. All the jurors, all 12. Otherwise, you have a hung jury. So the fact that they came to a verdict at all indicated they had all unanimously voted the same way, because that's how it is in a felony trial. It has to be unanimous to deprive a person of his freedom or of his life by executing him. It must be unanimous. Okay, returning to Watson. Was Luther Rosser timid in Frank's case? I would like to see Rosser when one of his timid spells gets a hold of him. Were Rosser and Arnold and the Haas brothers not only timid, but careless, unquote? Counselor Morse, spokesman for the American Academy of Jurisprudence, whatever that is, accuses these Georgia lawyers of cowardice or culpable negligence in their defense of Leo Frank. What? Is nobody to be spared? Shall no guilty Georgian escape? Must the propagandists of this Frank literature slaughter now his own lawyers? Is it a misdemeanor per se to be a Georgian? For the honor of the bar, Waldo Morse wishes that Rosser and Arnold and Haas and the governor's law firm, quote, had stood their ground, unquote. Then they did not stand their ground, and they dishonored the bar. That's terrible. Surely it is a cruel thing to stand Luther Rosser up before the universe in this tremendous manner and arraign him for professional cowardice. What say you, Luther? Are you guilty or not guilty? But Waldo Morse relentlessly continues, quote, might not the result have been different? Jurors have been known to change their verdict when facing the accused. We hope that the court may declare that no man and no state shall leave the issue of life as a bagatelle to be played for. Bagatelle means a trifling, minor thing. Arranged for and jeopardized by court and counsel in the absence of the man who may suffer. Unquote. So you see, Frank's lawyers are accused in a copyrighted indictment of playing with their client's life as a bagatelle, and of jeopardizing that life with a levity which showed an utter lack of a due sense of professional responsibility. That's mighty rough on Rosser and Arnold and Haas and Governor Slayton's law firm. Editorial note, these were the top lawyers in Georgia. The New York Jews had paid for the top lawyers in the state of Georgia, which is one of our major American states. It's ludicrous to now say, well, those no-good redneck Georgia lawyers, they didn't know what they're doing. They didn't defend Leo Frank correctly. That's one of the most ludicrous accusations in the northern newspapers. The equivalent of millions of dollars were spent on getting the finest lawyers in Georgia for this long, long trial, and then for all the appeals as well. I mean, the governor's own law firm was involved. Okay, returning to Watson. What would be your opinion of Counselor Morse when I tell you that Frank's lawyers did demand a poll of the jury, and each member was asked whether the verdict was his verdict, and each juror answered that it was? And each juror, months afterwards, made written affidavit to the same effect, utterly repudiating the charges of mob intimidation. Counselor Morse proceeds. Shall a man charged with an infamous crime be faced by a jury of 12 men, each one ready to announce their verdict of his guilt? May he ask each man of the 12 whether the verdict be his? Yes, has answered the common law for centuries. The accused may not even waive or abandon this right. Unquote. That's absurd. The accused may waive or abandon, quote, this right, unquote, and nearly every other. There are courts in which the accused is constantly waiving and abandoning their constitutional right to be indicted by a grand jury or tried by a petty jury. In almost every case, the accused waives his legal right to actual arraignment, oral pleading, and a copy of the indictment. Almost invariably, he waives the useless and perfunctory right of polling the jury. If he likes, he can go to trial with 11 jurors or less, and he may waive a legal disqualification of a juror. In fact, the accused, who can waive and abandon his right to the jury itself, can, of course, waive any lesser right. This may not be good law in the American Academy of Jurisprudence, but it is good law among good lawyers. Counselor Morse says that, quote, for centuries, unquote, it has been the common law right of the accused to ask each juror, quote, whether the verdict be his, unquote. This cocksure statement of what the English common law has been, quote, for centuries, unquote, would have had considerable weight had the counselor cited some authorities. It was in 1765 that Sir William Blackstone published the first volume of his Commentaries. And at that time, the accused in a capital case did not even have the right to be defended by a lawyer. At that time, there were upwards of 116 violations of law punishable by death, some of these capital offenses being petty larcenies and other trivial trespasses. In all those terrible cases, the accused was denied a lawyer at common law, and these fearful conditions were not materially changed until Sir Samuel Romilly began his noble work of law reform in 1808. At that time, it was death to pick a pocket, death to cut a tree in a park, death to filch from a bleach field, death to steal a letter, death to kill a rabbit, death to pilfer 5 shillings worth of stuff out of a store, death to forge a writing, death to steal a pig or a lamb, death to return home from transportation, death to write one's name on London Bridge. Sir Samuel was not able to accomplish a great deal before his suicide in 1818, but another great lawyer, Sir James Mackintosh, took up the work, Lord Brougham assisting. It is not until near the middle of the last century that the draconian code was stripped of most of its horrors, and the prisoner's counsel was allowed to address the jury. See McCarthy's Epoch of Reform, pages 144 and 145, and Mackenzie's The 19th Century, pages 124 and 125. Therefore, when any counselor for an American Academy of Jurisprudence glibly writes about what have been the common law rights of the accused for centuries, he makes himself ridiculous. As a general rule, a prisoner may waive any legal privilege, and whatever he may waive, his attorney may waive, and this waiver can be made after the trial and relate back to the time when he was entitled to the privilege. This waiver may be expressed or it may be implied. It may be in words and it may be in conduct. In Blackstone's Commentaries, nothing is said on the point of the prisoner's presence when the verdict comes in. Unquestionably, it is the better practice for him to be in court, but if his attorneys are present and they demand a poll of the jury, expressly waiving the presence of their client, they have done for the accused all that he could do for himself were he in court. For the prisoner is not allowed to ask the jurors any questions. The judge does that. Hence Frank lost nothing whatever by his absence, and when he failed to make that point, as he stood in court to be sentenced, and was asked by the judge, "What have you to say why sentence should not be pronounced on you?" he ratified the waiver his lawyers had made. He continued that ratification for a whole year. Not until after 2 motions for new trial had been filed did Frank raise this point about his absence at the time the verdict came in. And if he is set free on that point, the world will suspect that Rosser and Arnold laid a trap for the judge. Does it seem good law to Counselor Morse that a man whose guilt is made manifest by the official record should be turned loose to go scot-free on a technical point which involves the repudiation of his own lawyers and the retraction of his own ratification, which had lasted a year? Is there no such thing as a waiver by one's attorney and a ratification by one's prolonged acquiescence? Now, before going into close reasoning on the established facts in the case, allow me to call your attention to this point. Whoever wrote those notes that were found beside the body seems to say that she had been sexually used. Quote, "play with me," unquote. Quote, "said he would love me," unquote. Quote, "lay down," unquote. Quote, "play like Night Witch did it," unquote. Quote, "but that long, tall black Negro did it by hisself," unquote. These words are inconsistent with a crime whose main purpose was murder. Narrator's note: the accusation being made, the slander against Jim Conley, was that his goal was to rob and murder Mary Fagan. That's not what Thomas Watson believes. He believes that the purpose was sex, and when she resisted, Then it turned into murder because she violently fought back. Okay, continuing. Uppermost in the mind of the man who dictated those notes was quite another idea. Consistent with that idea, and not with murder alone, other words, quote, play with me, said he would love me, laid down, and play like the night witch did it, unquote. All have claimed that the words, quote, night witch, unquote, meant night watch. It may not be so. For the present, I only ask you to consider that the state's theory all along has been that Leo Frank was after this girl to enjoy her sexually, that the murder was a crime incident to her resistance. The girl worked for Frank, and he knew her well. He had sought to push his attentions on her. She had repulsed him. She had told her friend George Epps that she was afraid of him on account of the way he had acted toward her. He had refused on Friday afternoon to let Helen Ferguson have Mary's pay envelope, containing the pitiful sum of $1.20. He thus made it necessary for Mary to come in person for it, which she was sure to do next day, since the universal Saturday custom is to pay for things bought during the preceding week and buy things for the next. Narrators note what Watson is saying is that this is, 100 years ago. People got their money on Saturday, and they paid their previous bills, and they bought food for the next week. Saturday was the big shopping day because, people worked Monday through Friday, and Sunday they went to church. So Saturday was the big money day. So she was definitely going to come in to pick up her pay. Okay, end of narrator's note. Continuing back to Watson. Why did not Frank give Mary's pay envelope to Helen when Helen asked for it on Friday? It had been the habit of Helen to get Mary's envelope, and Frank could hardly have been ignorant of the fact. Did he refuse to let Helen have Mary's pay because it was not good business? That hypothesis fails when we examine Frank's own statement to the jury. On page 179 of the record, he tells the jury that Maddie Smith came for a pay envelope on Saturday morning, the 26th of April, and she asked for that of her sister-in-law also. Quote, and I went to the safe and got out the package and gave her the required 2 envelopes, unquote. Therefore, Frank himself was in the habit of letting one employee have another's pay envelope. On that same morning, he gave the pay envelopes of 2 of the boys to their fathers, Graham and Burdett, according to page 181. Why did Frank make an exception of Mary Fagan this one time? Why did he discriminate against her and only her that weekend? Be the answer what it may, the girl, all decked out in her cheap little finery for Confederate Memorial Day, comes with her smart, fresh lavender dress, the flowers in her hat, the ribbons on her dress, her gay parasol, and her best stockings and silk garters, comes into the heart of the great city. About noon, goes immediately to Frank's office for her $1.20, is traced by evidence which Frank dared not deny into his office, and is never more seen alive. Is there any reasonable person on the face of God's earth who wouldn't say Frank must account for that girl? When a mountain of evidence piled up on the fact of the girl's going to him, he then admitted that she did go to him somewhere around 12 o'clock that day. He says that a little girl, whom he afterwards learned to be Mary Fagan, came to him for her pay envelope. He pretended not to know that a girl of her name worked for him until he consulted the payroll. He went through the motion of looking at the payroll for the purpose of ascertaining whether such a human being worked in his place. After having found her name on the list, he then admitted that a girl named Mary Fagan had been working there. What sort of impression does this make on you, in view of the fact that 4 white witnesses swore that he had seen Frank talk to her and that in doing so he called her Mary? Narrator's note, when Watson keeps emphasizing 4 white witnesses, he's not saying that, just because they were white they were telling the truth, or if they were black they were not telling the truth. The point is that the Northern Jewish-owned newspapers kept repeating the lie that Leo Frank had been convicted solely on the word of the Negro janitor, Jim Conley, and that he had been jailed for being a drunk, he'd been jailed for fighting. That was all true, But it is not true that Leo Frank was convicted and sentenced to death on the word of the Negro janitor. He couldn't have been because the janitor was his accomplice. And under Georgia law, you cannot be convicted on the word of your accomplice because obviously his motive is to shift the blame to you and your motive is to shift the blame on him. So there have to be other witnesses. So it's completely wrong. So when he says the four white witnesses, what he's emphasizing is it was not the word of the black man that convicted Leo Frank. That was just part of it. It was as many white witnesses who said things, and he's saying this to relate better to his audience. In other words, this white man did not get the death sentence based on the word of a low-life black janitor. So that's why he's saying that. Okay, resuming. Why did Frank, when her dead body was found in the basement, feign not to know her and say that he would have to consult the payroll? The girl, dressed up for a holiday, was in Frank's office at about the noon hour of that fatal day, and those two were alone. Why then did she continue to work there? She needed the money and felt strong in her virtue. She never dreamed of violence. She kept on working as many poor girls do who cannot help themselves. Freedom to choose which job you'll take is not a luxury of the poor. But let us pass on. The fatal day comes, and Mary comes, and then her light goes out. The pretty little girl who had dressed up for the holiday and gone out, radiant with youth and health and beauty, to enjoy it as other young girls all over the South were doing. She goes into Frank's own private office, and that's the last of her. What became of her? Tell us, Luther Rosser. Tell us, Herbert Haas. Tell us, Nathan Strauss. Tell us, Adolph Ochs of the New York Times. Tell us, Rabbi Marx. Tell us, William Randolph Hearst, the major press baron of the day. What became of our girl? Your man Frank had her last. What did he do with her? So far as I can discover, the only theory advanced by the defenders of Leo Frank is hung upon Jim Conley. They claim that Jim darted out upon Mary as she stepped aside on the first floor, cut her scalp with a blow, rendered her unconscious, pushed her through the scuttle hole, and then went down after her, tied the cord around her neck, choked her to death, hid the body, wrote the notes, and broke out by the basement door. If the defense has any other theory than this, I have been unable to find it. And they must have a theory, for the girl was killed in the factory immediately after she left Frank's private office. There is the undeniable fact of the murdered girl. And no matter what may be the, quote, jungle fury, unquote, of the Atlanta, quote, mob, unquote, and of the, quote, semi-barbarians, unquote, of our state of Georgia, these mobs and barbarians did not kill the girl. Either the Cornell graduate did it, or Jim Conley did it. Did Jim Conley do it? If so, how and why? What was his motive, and what was his method? The defense claims that he struck her the blow, splitting the scalp, on the first floor, where he worked immediately after she left Frank's office on the second floor. They claim that the Negro then dragged the unconscious body to the scuttle hole. Scuttle hole, by the way, you did coal. You pour coal or something else for running the boilers in the furnace in the basement. So that's what a scuttle hole. It's a trap door for coal and things like that to be dropped down. Narrator's note. Okay. I'll repeat. They claim that the Negro then dragged the unconscious body to the scuttle hole and flung her down that ladder. What sort of hole is it? All the evidence concurs in its being a small opening in the floor with a trapdoor over it and only large enough to admit one person at a time. It is 2 feet square. Reaching from the opening of this hole down to the floor of the basement is a ladder with open rungs. Now, when Jim Conley supposedly hit the girl in the head and split her scalp, and of course when you split someone's scalp, all kinds of blood comes out. It's amazing there's a lot of blood in the head and the brain area, and if you split someone's the skin of their head, it's amazing how much blood will come out. So, repeat. Now, when Jim Conley hit the girl in the head and split her scalp, they claim he pushed her through the trap door so that she would fall into the basement below. But how could the limp and bleeding body fall down that ladder, striking rung after rung on its way down, without leaving blood marks on the ladder, and without the face and head of poor dying Mary being all bunged up, broken, and cut open by the repeated beatings against the rounds of the ladder? How could that bleeding head have lain at the foot of the ladder without leaving an accusing puddle of blood? How could that bleeding body, still alive, have been choked to death in the cellar, leaving no blood on the basement floor, none on the ladder, none at the trapdoor, none on the table where they claim the notes are written, and none on the pads and notes? Not a particle of the testimony points suspicion toward the Negro before the crime. He lived with a kept Negro woman, as so many of his race do, but he had never been accused of any offense more grave than the police commonplace, disorderly conduct. His fines ranged from $1.75 to $15. He was at the factory on the day of the crime, and Mrs. Arthur White saw him sitting quietly on the first floor, where it was his business to be. After the crime, there was never any evidence discovered against him. He did lie as to his doings at the time of the crime, but all of these were consistent with the plan of Frank and Conley to shield each other. Frank was just as careful to keep suspicion from settling on the Negro as the Negro was to keep it from settling on Frank. You would naturally suppose that the white man, reasoning swiftly, would have realized that the crime lay between himself and the Negro, and that as he knew himself to be innocent, he knew the Negro must be guilty. Any white man, under those circumstances, would at once have seen that only himself or the Negro could have done the deed, since no others had the opportunity. Hence the white man, being conscious of innocence, and bold in it, would have said to the police, to the detectives, to the world, quote, "No other man could have done this thing except Jim Conley or myself, and since I did not do it, Jim Conley did. I demand that you arrest him at once and let me face him." Did Frank do that? Did the Cornell graduate break out into a fury of injured innocence, point to Conley as the criminal, and go to him and question him as to his actions that fatal day? No, indeed. Frank never once hinted Conley's guilt. Frank never once asked to be allowed to face Conley. Frank hung his head when he talked to Newt Lee, trembled and shook and swallowed and drew deep breaths and kept shuffling his legs and couldn't sit still, walked nervously to the windows and wrung his hands a dozen times within a few minutes, insinuated that J.M. Gant might have committed the crime, and suggested that Newt Lee's house ought to be searched, but never a single time threw suspicion on Jim Conley, or suggested that Jim's house ought to be searched. Did the Negro want to rob somebody in the factory? Could he have chosen a worse place? Could he have chosen a poorer victim, and one more likely to make a stout fight? Mary had not worked that week, except a small fraction of the time, and Jim knew it. Therefore he knew that her pay envelope held less than that of any of the girls. Did Jim Conley want to assault some woman in the factory? Could he have chosen a worse time and place? If he did it, on the first floor at the front where white people were coming and going, and where his boss, Mr. Frank, might come downstairs any minute on his way to his noon meal? No Negro that ever lived would attempt to outrage a white woman almost in the presence of a white man. Between the hour of 12:05 and 12:10, Montine Stover walked up the stairs from the first floor to Frank's office on the second, and she walked right through his outer office into his inner office. And Frank was not there. She waited 5 minutes and left. She saw nobody. She did not see Conley, and she did not see Frank. Where were they? And where was Mary Fagan? It is useless to talk about streetcar schedules, about the variations in clocks, about the condition of cabbage in the stomach, and about the menstrual blood, and all that sort of secondary matter. Narrator's note, this is what the defense team was throwing up, all kinds of confusing debates about secondary topics, unquote. Back to Watson. The vital point is this. Where was Mary, and where was Frank, and where was Conley during the 25 minutes before Mrs. White saw both Frank and Conley? Above all, where was Frank when Montine Stover went through both his offices, the inner as well as the outer, and couldn't find him? She wanted to find him, for she needed her money. She wanted to find him, for she lingered 5 minutes. Where was Frank while Montine was in his office and was waiting for him? That's the point in the case. All else is subordinate. Rosser and Arnold are splendid lawyers. No one doubts that. They were employed on account of their preeminent rank at the bar. I have been with them in great cases, and know that whatever it is possible to do in a forensic battle, they are able to do. Do you suppose for one moment that Rosser and Arnold did not see the terrible significance of Montine's evidence? They saw it clearly, and they made frantic efforts to get away from it. How? First, they put up Lemmy Quinn, another employee of Frank, to testify that he had gone to Frank's office at 12:20 that Saturday and found Frank there. But Lemmy Quinn's evidence recoiled on Frank, hurting the case badly. Why? Because two white ladies whom the defendant put up as his witnesses swore positively that they were in the factory just before noon, and that after they left Frank, they went to a cafe where they found Lemmy Quinn, and he told them he had just been up to the office to see Frank. Mrs. Emma Freeman, one of the ladies, swore that as she was leaving the factory, she looked at Frank's own clock, and it was 11:45. Mrs. Freeman testified that as she passed on up the stairs in the factory building, she saw Frank talking to two men in his office. One of these men was no doubt Lemmy Quinn. At any rate, after she had talked to the lady on the fourth floor, Mrs. White, and had come down to Frank's office to use his telephone, the men were gone. And when she met Quinn at the cafe, he told her that he had just been up to Frank's office. Hence the testimony of Mrs. Emma Clark Freeman and Miss Corinthia Hall smashed the attempted alibi, and of course the abortive attempt at the alibi hurt the case terribly. Let me do Mr. Quinn the justice to say that he merely estimated the time of day by the time it would have taken him to walk from his home, and that he admitted he had stopped on the way at Wolfsheimer's, narrator's note, a bar, for 10 or 15 minutes, all of which is obvious guesswork. He frankly admitted that when he met Mrs. Freeman and Miss Hall at the Busy Bee Cafe, he told them he had just been up to Frank's office. Secondly, the able lawyers for the defense endeavored to meet Montine Stover's evidence by the statement of Frank himself. This statement is so extraordinary that I will quote the words from the record. Now, gentlemen, to the best of my recollection, from the time the whistle blew for 12 o'clock until after 1:45, when I went upstairs and spoke to Arthur White and Harry Denham, to the best of my recollection, I did not stir out of the inner office. But it is possible that to answer a call of nature or to urinate, I may have gone to the toilet. Those are things that a man does unconsciously, and cannot tell how many times, nor when he does it. Here, then, was the second of the two desperate but futile attempts to account for the whereabouts of Frank at the fatal period of time when he and Mary are both missing. Pray note this. Frank's first statement, made a few hours after Mary's corpse was found, made no mention of Lemmy Quinn's coming to the office after Hattie Hall left. The effort to sandwich Quinn between Hattie Hall and Mrs. White was a bungle and an afterthought. It showed he felt he must try to fill in that interval, and the failure showed his inability to do it. Hence he is left totally unaccounted for during the half hour when the crime was committed. Frank's final statement, the one he made to the jury, hurt him another way. He said he was continuously in his office after Hattie Hall left, whereas Mrs. Arthur White, on her unexpected return to the factory, surprised him in his outer office, where he was standing before the safe with his back to the door. He jumped when she spoke to him, and he turned round as he answered. He did not explain what he was doing at the safe at that time, 12:35 p.m. And the state's theory is that he had been putting Mary's mesh bag and pay envelope in the safe. The only material thing about it is that he was out of his inner office at 12:35 and not continuously in it up to nearly 1 o'clock as he declared he was, and he had never even attempted to explain why he was at the safe at that time. The fact that Conley may have been missing too is secondary and more doubtful. Montine did not come there to look for him. Her mind was not on Jim Conley. Montine's mind was on her money and the man who had it. She went there to find Frank. She says, quote, "I went through the first office into the second office. I went to get my money. I went into Mr. Frank's office. He was not there. I stayed there 5 minutes, and left at 10 minutes after 12, unquote. Mrs. Freeman and Miss Hall had already been there. Lemmy Quinn had also already been there, and these visitors, having gone up to Frank, came down again. Next comes pretty Miss Fagin, and she goes up to Frank, and Frank receives her in his private office. And when Montine comes up into that same office, in her noiseless tennis shoes, at 5 minutes after 12, neither Mary nor Frank were to be heard or seen. Oh, where were they then? To the end of time and the crack of doom, that question will ring in the ears and the souls of right-feeling people. Frank says he may have unconsciously gone to the toilet. Then he has unconsciously put his feet in the murderer's tracks. The notes make Mary Fagin go to the same place at the same time, and the blood spots and the hair on the lathe show that she died there. On page 185 of the official record, Frank says, "To the best of my knowledge, it must have been 10 or 15 minutes after Miss Hall left my office when this little girl, whom I afterwards found to be Mary Fagin, entered my office and asked for her pay envelope. I asked for her number, and she told me. I went to the cash box and took her envelope out and handed it to her, identifying the envelope by the number. She left my office and apparently had gotten as far as the door from my office leading to the outer office, when she evidently stopped and asked me if the medal had arrived, and I told her no. She continued her way out." Note Frank's studied effort to make appear that he did not even lift his eyes and look at this rosy, plump, and most attractive maid. He does not even know that she stopped at his inner office door when she spoke to him. She had evidently stopped apparently at the door. He does not know for certain. He was not looking at her to see. She spoke to him, and he to her, but he does not know positively that she stopped, nor positively where she was at the time. He did not recognize her at all. She gave him her number, and he found an envelope to match the number, and he gave it to the little girl, whom he afterwards found to be Mary Fagin. Found? How? By looking at the payroll and seeing that Mary's name corresponded with the number that was on the pay envelope. Let me pause here long enough to remind you that J.M. Gant, Dewey Howell, W.E. Turner, and Miss Ruth Robinson all swore positively under oath that Frank did know Mary Fagin personally, by sight and by name. But what follows after Mary leaves Frank's office? He says she had hardly left the plant 5 minutes when Lemmy Quinn came in. But Miss Corinthia Hall and Mrs. Emma Clark Freeman and Quinn himself made it plain that Quinn had already been there and gone before they arrived. When did they arrive, and when did they leave? They came at 11:35 and left at 11:45. They were Frank's own witnesses, and they demolished the Lemmy Quinn alibi and Frank's own statement. What can be said in answer to that? Nothing. It is one of those providential mishaps in a case of circumstantial evidence that makes the cold chills run up the back of the lawyer for the defense. I know, for I have had them run up my back. I know them of old. Narrator's note: Watson himself was a lawyer, a trial lawyer. So when he's writing this article and other articles, he knows exactly what he's talking about. See if you get the full force of the point. Remember that Frank's lawyers put up Mrs. Freeman and Miss Hall to account for Frank at the fatal period when he seemed to be missing. Evidently, they're expected to account for Frank up to Lemmy Quinn's arrival, and after that, Lemmy was to do the rest. But Mrs. Freeman and Miss Hall not only arrived too soon, but got there after Lemmy. When they left at 11:45 by the clock in Frank's own office, they went to the cafe, and who should be there but Lemmy? And Lemmy, in the innocence of his heart, said that he had just been up to Frank's office. Mary Fagin, as all the evidence shows, was at that time on her way to the fatal trap. The evidence of Frank's 3 witnesses, Miss Hall, Mrs. Freeman, and Lemmy Quinn, proves that he told the jury a deliberate falsehood when he said that Quinn was with him after Mary Fagin left. That's the crisis of the case. Desperately he tries to show where he was after the girl came, and desperately he says that Quinn came after Mary left, and that Quinn knows he was there in his office after Mary had departed. Ah, no, the great God would not let that lie prosper. Mrs. Freeman, Miss Hall, and Quinn put themselves in and out, there and away, come and gone, before Mary came. And where does that leave Frank? The plank he grabbed at, he missed. the straw he caught at sunk with him. When Lemmy Quinn fails him, he sinks into that fearful unknown of the half hour, when the unexpected Montine Stover softly comes into the outer office, goes right on into Frank's inner office, seeking her money, and cannot find Frank. The place is silent. The place is deserted. She waits 5 minutes, hears nothing, and sees nobody. Then she leaves. Where were you, Leo Frank? And where was our little girl? Desperately, Frank says he may have gone to the closet. Narrator's note, the water closet, or, the toilet. Fatefully, the notes say Mary went to the closet. Fatally, her golden hair leaves some of its golden strands on the metal lever where her head struck as Frank hit her, and her blood splotched the floor at the dressing room where Conley dropped her. What broke the hymen? That is referring to, her private parts, her vagina, and, the evidence of her virginity. So he says, what broke the hymen? What tore the inner tissues? What caused the dilated blood vessels? What laceration stained the drawers with her vaginal blood? How came the outer vagina bloody? Narrator's note is pretty gory. Again, and with apologies, it is vital to see what the jury saw, the actual death clothes, the cord, her hat, everything. And the public knew about these things, especially via the Thomas Watson articles such as this one. In this way, you can understand why the lynching took place and how atrocious the violence of that rape was. And what I have in the article at johnnugent.com on the Watson's March 1915 article, Leo Frank case, a full review. I have a photo of the death clothes. This is a replica, a more modern replica made. We just have a black and white photo, but the crime scene clothes have been recreated with, I guess, something to look like blood, ketchup, whatever they use. It's horrifying to see the blood over the neck and chest area that dribbled onto the clothes, and especially in her private area, which had soaked into the dress. It is far too easy to focus on the guilt or innocence of Leo Frank, or his legal strategies and his detectives, and forget the sickening final minute of this pure young lady's life, her blood crying from the grave. Hatred of Leo Frank, the child rapist killer, ran high in Georgia, and as in prisons around America, even hardened convicts found this child killer beyond the pale. 1 month before his August 1915 lynching, a prison inmate named William Crean attempted to kill him with a butcher knife to the throat. Frank barely survived, and his throat had barely healed from that attack when top citizens of Georgia stormed the Milledgeville State Prison, abducted, and lynched him. The lynchers drove all night along back roads back from Milledgeville Prison to Marietta, Georgia, where Mary had grown up, and there the elected sheriff of that county, W.D. Watson, hanged him. The words from the January edition of Watson's magazine were engraved on Mary Fagan's flat covering tombstone on the ground on the Marietta, Georgia cemetery. They're really immortal words, and they ended the January 1915 article by Thomas Watson. I'd like to read them again, even though it's from the previous article, because these are the words which are inscribed on her tombstone. And these were the words which I think helped lead to the lynching, because the emotions were already high. And because of this heroic publisher, Thomas Watson, the men of Georgia felt, we cannot let this murderer escape justice. And thinking of her bravery, and it made them brave, want to do the brave and the right and the masculine thing. Okay, now the final words from Watson's January 1915 article, which preceded this article, which was March 1915. I'll put a little southern accent on. In this day of fading ideals and disappearing landmarks, little Mary Fagan's heroism is an heirloom than which there is nothing more precious among the old red hills of Georgia. Sleep, little girl, sleep in your humble grave. But if the angels are good to you in the realms beyond the troubled sunset and clouded stars, they will let you know that many an aching heart in Georgia beats for you, and many a tear from eyes unused to weep has paid you a tribute too sacred for words. Okay, continuing back to the article now. Who split her drawers all the way up? Who did the violence to the parts that Dr. Harris swore to? The blow that bruised and blackened but did not break the skin was in front over the eye, which was much swollen when the corpse was found. The blow that cut the scalp to the bone and caused unconsciousness was on the back of the head. Who struck her with his fist in the face and knocked her down so that in falling the crank handle of the machine cut the scalp and tore out some of her hair? How did anybody get a chance to hit her in the back of the head and not throw her on her face? Would a Negro go for a cord with which to choke a white woman he had assaulted? Would a Negro have remained with the body or cared what became of it and taken the awful risks of getting it down 2 floors to the basement? Would a Negro have lingered by the corpse to write a note on yellow paper and another note on white paper? Would a Negro have loafed there to compose notes at all? What Negro ever did such a thing after such a crime? Place in front of you a square piece of blank paper, longer than it is broad. An old envelope will do. This square piece of paper, longer than it is broad, will represent the floor of the building, the second floor upon which Mary Fagan was done to death. Draw a line through the middle of the square from top to bottom, cutting the long square into 2 lesser squares. These will sufficiently represent the 2 large rooms into which the second floor was divided by a partition. Mark a place in the center of the partition for the door which opens one room into the other. Where was Frank's office? It was the upper right-hand corner of the room, to your right, as the square lies lengthwise before you. Mark off a small square at that corner for Frank's office. Mark off a small square in the left-hand corner of the second room, and run a line through it to divide this small closet into 2 divisions. One of these small divisions was the water closet of the men, the other of the women. You cannot crumple a piece of paper in the one without being heard in the other. We naturally turn to Frank, and we naturally ask him, what did Mary do after you gave her the pay envelope? Where did she go? He cannot answer, but thereupon we take it up another way, and we ask him this question. Where were you after Mary left? Did you stay in your office? Did you go anywhere and do anything? Now follow the facts closely. Frank's own detective, Harry Scott, in his energetic efforts to find the criminal, pinned Frank down as to where he was after 12 o'clock. Frank told Harry Scott, in the hearing of Atlanta Police Detective John Black, that he was continuously in his office during the 45 minutes after Mary had come and gone. The white lady, Mrs. Arthur White, returned at 12:35 and found Frank in his office, standing before the iron safe. Narrator's note, the question is, why was he standing there at the safe? There were no employees coming to get their pay envelope, so why was he standing at the safe? Was he putting some personal effects of Mary Fagan into the safe for hiding? He didn't know where to put certain things. So that's another whole suspicious thing about Leo Frank. Why was he standing at the open safe when nobody was there to get money? Was it a hiding place for certain things? Okay, back to Watson. He jumped nervously when he heard her. Now then, Montine Stover went to Frank's office after Mary had gone away from it, and before Mrs. White came back at 12:35. Where was Frank then? Right there, in that fateful half-hour, lies the crime. Who is the criminal? If Frank had been in his office, Montine would of course have seen him when she went to it, and he would have seen her. He did not see her, and therefore did not know that she had been there until after he had told Harry Scott, the Pinkerton's detective, positively and repeatedly that he was in his office then. It was afterward, when the unimpeachable Montine told what she knew, that Frank saw how he had boxed himself up. Then it was that such a persistent and desperate effort was made to get Montine's evidence out of the way. Narrator's note: at this point, what Watson is referring to is the attempts to bully or possibly even bribe Montine Stover to change her testimony. And we know that there was a massive amount of threatening and bribes going on in Atlanta at that time. This is an open scandal, and of course it caused tremendous bitterness in the public. Okay, returning to Watson. Then it was that Burns, that is, of the William J. Burns Agency, the other team of detectives, then it was that Burns in person tried first to persuade and then to bulldoze her. Why don't some of Frank's paid champions dwell on that ugly phase of his case? The enormous weight which Frank's lawyers and detectives, such as Burns and Lahan, attached to Montine's evidence is the best proof that Montine's evidence clinches the guilt of Frank. When Frank told Scott and Black that he was in his office continuously after Mary left, he knew the vital necessity of accounting for his whereabouts at that particular time. He knew it even then. And what Watson is referring to here, as a narrator's note, is the first interrogations of Leo Frank right after he was arrested. Returning to Watson. His definite, positive placing of himself during that particular half hour shows that he knew it. But how came he to know it? If someone else made away with the girl, he did not then know when the deed was done. Narrator's note. What Watson is trying to emphasize here is, in reality, theoretically, Mary Fagan could have been murdered any time that afternoon or that evening. Certainly, of course, the Fagan family did not sound the alarm until 6 or 7 o'clock that evening. They started to get worried later on, but, she was supposed to be at the Confederate Memorial Day parade and, come home toward evening. When she didn't come home in the evening, then there was worry. But Mary Fagan could have been murdered at any time that afternoon. But Leo Frank was very, very eager to tell the detectives where he was in the half an hour after she came for her pay. So Watson asks, why was he so interested in explaining where he was minute by minute at that time? How did he know that was when she died? Okay, back to Watson. If someone else made away with the girl, he did not then know when the deed was done. If he was as innocent as you and I, he did not then know any better than you and I then did the vast materiality of his whereabouts at any one half hour of that fatal day. How came he at that time to be so extremely careful to account for himself for that special half hour? And why did he lie about it? He does not deny what he told Scott and Black. He does not accuse Montine of a perjury for which she had no motive. He stated to the jury that he might have gone to the water closet on a call of nature, which he curiously said is an act that a person does, quote, without being conscious of it, unquote. If Frank told Scott and Black a deliberate falsehood as to his whereabouts, that is a powerful circumstance against him. If he was actually out of his office just after Mary left, that also is a powerful circumstance against him, provided he cannot tell where he was. If in giving the only possible account of himself, he puts himself at the water closet, and the crime gets right up to him, provided Mary was ravished and killed in that same room. Now where was Mary ravished and killed? The blood marks and the hair say, in that same room, and the notes say, in that same room. The blood marks tell where she was, and if Frank went out of his office to go to the closet, he went right there. The notes make Mary say that she went to the closet, quote, to make water, unquote. And if she did, she went right there. Now, if a Negro seized her, raped her, and killed her, he had to be right there, where Frank said he was, when absent from his office. But if Frank was in his office, and Montine is a liar without motive, how could a Negro come up from the lower floor, where Mrs. White saw him, and commit the crime without Frank hearing or seeing a single thing to excite his suspicion. Whereas the Negro who would go that close to a white man's office when he knew the white man was there to commit such a fiendish crime upon a white girl? And how did the Negro by himself get the body from the second floor down to the basement? Narrator's note, what Watson is saying here, and it's kind of complicated, the whole thing, to kind of imagine all these facts and how they fit together. It's basically saying that if Jim Conley had raped and killed Mary Fagan, it was clearly on the second floor because her hair and her blood were there. Then he would have had to have a tussle with the girl, strike her, have her fall, crack her head open, and then rape her, and then drag her body past Mr. Frank's office, and then from on the second floor down to the first floor, and then from there, she probably weighed 90 pounds, which is quite heavy. She was kind of big for her age. She was almost 14. She wasn't fat, but she was well built. So how could this have escaped the notice of Leo Frank? No. The person who was raping her, Mary Fagan, and strangling her and killing her was Leo Frank. That's Watson's point. No Negro, especially in the heyday of lynching, which is 1880 to 1920, would have dared rape a white girl almost in the presence and certainly in the earshot of a white man. It was just absolutely unthinkable. And for audiences reading, and there were lynchings up north as well. In fact, in the 1920s, the Ku Klux Klan expanded tremendously up north. So the whole idea of Jim Conley having done it is simply unimaginable to anyone who understands especially the times obtaining back then. Mary's body was found on the night of Saturday the 26th. It appeared to have been dead a long time. Quote, the body was cold and stiff, unquote. The notes were lying close by. Newt Lee, narrator's note, the night watchman, went on duty for the night, as usual, that Saturday night, and it was he who found the body on that night at about 3 o'clock. That is 3 o'clock in the morning. That is actually, Sunday, or very early Sunday morning. Therefore, you have a clear case of murder on Saturday, sometime after the noon hour, and before Newt Lee came on duty as night watchman at 6 o'clock p.m. Conley was not back in the building that day after 1 o'clock. Frank was. The record shows this. The circumstances conclusively prove that someone did the deed during the half hour following Mary's coming to Frank's office. Frank admits that he is the last white person with whom she was ever seen. The blood and the notes say she was assaulted on Frank's floor, near the closets which she and Frank both used. The notes make her go to the closet to answer a call of nature immediately after she left Frank. She did not go upstairs. She had no work to do in the factory that day. And if she went to the toilet at all, she went there from Frank's office. She never again appeared downstairs or out of doors. If she had gone upstairs, Mrs. White and others would have known it. If she had gone downstairs, both Frank and Conley would know it. Yet at 12:35, Mrs. White saw Frank, but did not see the girl. She had disappeared during the very time that Frank disappears, and when Frank gets back into his office at 12:35, that little girl is out there near the toilet, in the next room, choking to death. Narrator's note, that is, from the cord which had been tied extremely tightly around her neck to choke her and actually cut deeply into her skin. It was Frank who was close to her. It was the Negro who was downstairs. No wonder Frank, quote, jumped, unquote, when Mrs. White came up behind and spoke to him. No wonder he hurried Mrs. White out of the building, hesitated to allow J.M. Gant to go in to look for his shoes, and refused to let Newt Lee, the night watchman, enter the building where he worked. By all the evidence, Frank and Jim were the only living mortals in that part of the house at that time. Mary undoubtedly was there at the time by Frank's own line of defense. There was one short sentence in Captain J.N. Starnes' redirect examination that did not rivet my special attention at first. That sentence was, quote, hands folded across the breast, unquote. That simple statement came back again and again, knocking at the door, as if it were saying, explain me. How did it happen that a girl who had been raped or murdered, or both, was found with her hands folded over her breast? How could a girl who had been knocked in the head on the first floor and tumbled down into the basement through a scuttle hole and over a ladder, as defendant claims, have her hands resting quietly on her bosom? Frank's theory represents Jim as attacking Mary on the first floor, finishing her in the basement below, then writing the notes, breaking the door, and speeding away. That theory does not account for those folded hands. A girl knocked on the head into unconsciousness and then choked to death with a cord does not fold her own hands across her bosom. Oh, no. In the agony of death, her arms will be spread out. And if hours later those arms are found across her bosom, the little hands meeting over the pulseless heart, be sure that somebody who remembers intuitively how the dead should be treated has put those agonized hands together. There were the indisputable and undisputed facts. A bloody corpse with a wound in the head, torn underclothing, privates bloody, a light cord sunk into the soft flesh of the neck, the face blackened and scratched by dragging across a bare floor of cinders and grit, and yet when turned over and found, quote, cold and stiff, unquote, the testimony curtly adds, quote, hands folded across the breast, unquote. How did that happen? Who folded those little hands across the heart, which beat no more? In vain I searched the evidence. Nowhere was there an explanation. In fact, nobody had seemed to be struck by that brief, clear statement of Captain Starnes, which everybody conceded to be strictly true. Quote, hands folded across the breast, unquote. Mind you, when she was found in the basement, she was lying on her face, not directly on her stomach, but so much so that they had to, quote, turn her over, unquote, to see her face and wipe the dust and dirt off for the purpose of recognition. See official record, pages 7, 8, and 9. Lying on her face, had to turn her over, and, quote, the body was cold and stiff, unquote. But the frozen hands, where were they? Quote, folded across the breast, unquote. Then they had become rigid in that position. They had not come off the bosom even when the body was turned over. They had remained across the breast while the body was being dragged. Dr. Westmoreland and Dr. Harrows would probably agree for at least one time, and both would say as competent experts that those hands, to remain fixed under those circumstances, had been placed across the girl's bosom before the stiffness set in. Death froze them there. You may read every line of the evidence on both sides, as I did, and you will not find any explanation of those folded hands. Hands folded as no murdered woman's ever were found before, except where somebody, not the murderer, instinctively followed universal custom and folded them. Can you escape that conclusion? No, you can't. At least I couldn't, and I have been reading and trying murder cases nearly all my life. Then, as a last resort, in my efforts to satisfy myself about that unparalleled circumstance of the folded hands, I decided to turn to Jim Conley's evidence, saying to myself as I did so, if that ignorant Negro explains that fact, whose importance he cannot possibly have known, it will be a marvelous thing, unquote. So I turned to Conley's evidence, searching for that one thing. Page 55, I found it. Here it is. Quote, she was dead when I got back there, and I came back and told Mr. Frank, and he said, shh. The girl was lying flat on her back, and her hands were out this way. At this point in my article, where I've added many photos, I have two photographs from the period of the Civil War. One of them has the caption, a fallen Confederate soldier found at Alsop Farm, Spotsylvania, Virginia, 1864. Rigor mortis froze his hands in the raised position. It's amazing. His hands are actually like up in the air. I had no idea that rigor mortis could happen. And there's a second photo also of a Confederate soldier with his arms raised in the air and frozen. It's incredibly how fast the rigor mortis took place. And many people have commented on this, and Watson will comment on this. Spotsylvania was a great battle, 24 straight hours of hand-to-hand combat during May of 1864. Okay, back to Watson now. I put both of her hands down easy and rolled her up in the cloth. I looked back a little way and saw her hat and piece of ribbon and her slippers, and I'd taken them and put them all in the cloth. Unquote. The girl was lying flat on her back, hands out this way, and he illustrated on the witness stand. I put both her hands down. Then they were not only out, but they're up, as if the pitiful little victim had been pushing something or somebody off. Those dead hands are fearful accusers of those white men who now say that Mary Phagan did not value her virtue. Narrator's note. What really makes Watson angry, makes me angry too, 100 years later, is the defamation of the murder victim by saying, oh, she was a loose girl and she probably wanted to have sex and that kind of thing. It's just really outrageous. Her hands were up as if she were pushing some man off. And when she was strangled, she died with her hands still up. And so the black janitor, Jim Connolly, is saying, I put her hands down. Her hands were up in the air, frozen in death, and he put her hands down, folded them, respect for the dead, which is, one nice human thing that Jim Connolly did do. I think he was probably appalled at the murder, and we know that 20 years later he did visit the Phagan and Coleman family to talk about what happened. So I think he did feel horror at that moment, and he felt great remorse afterwards as well. And so he placed the little girl's hands over her chest, and sort of the symbol of death and being asleep in death and so forth. Okay, back to the reading. Again, I'll repeat that sentence. Those dead hands that were raised up that Jim Connolly originally saw. Those dead hands are fearful accusers of the white men who now say that Mary Phagan did not value her virtue. On the other hand, there was issued by the Neal Publishing Company a new book of war experiences written by a Philadelphia surgeon, Dr. John H. Brinton. He relates some vivid incidents showing the rapid action of rigor mortis, the instantaneous rigor, following mortal wounds received in battle. He made a special study of the dead on the field which the North calls Antietam. Our name for it is Sharpsburg. On page 207, Dr. Brinton speaks of the cornfield and sunken road, so famous to the literature of the war, referring, of course, to the Civil War. And he says, quote, dead bodies were everywhere. Many of these were in extraordinary attitudes, some with their arms raised rigidly in the air. I also noticed the body of a Southern soldier. The body was in a semi-erect posture. One arm extended was stretched forward. His musket with ramrod halfway down had dropped from his hand. Back to Watson. This Southern soldier had been lying in the road, had half risen to load and shoot, had been shot while driving the ramrod home, and the gun had dropped, but the soldier himself remained, face to the foe, half erect, with, quote, one arm extended and stretched forward. Brave Southern soldier, death itself could not rob him of the proofs of his unfailing heroism. And again, I have two photos of Southern soldiers with their arms raised up in the stiffness of death, sticking out in the air, against the law of gravity. And Watson continues, brave Southern girl, death itself would not rob Mary Phagan of the proofs that she fought for her innocence to the very last. Shame upon those white men who desecrate the murdered child's grave and who add to the torture of the mother that lost her by saying Mary was an unclean little wanton. Jim Conley had no motive to describe her hands as being uplifted, and he, an ignorant Negro, could not have realized the stupendous psychological significance of it. What Watson means by this is her hands were like fighting off somebody. At the moment and the second of her death, she was fighting and pushing away some man. Was fighting, trying to fight some guy off, and he put her arms down. Now again, the murderer would be full of hatred and anger and violence toward the victim. He's not going to do something pious like folding her little hands over her breast, in the sort of a sacred funeral type death position. So these are very important details, actually. And it's great that we have in Thomas Watson, a great publisher, a great hero, and also a man with a tremendous interest in the law and who was a lawyer with many decades of experience in practicing law and in dealing with murder cases. Okay, back to Watson. Providence was against Frank in this case. The stars in their courses fought against him, as they fought against Sisera. His lawyers must have felt it. Providence was against him in the time of Montine Stover's unexpected visit to his office. Providence was against him in the unexpected return of Mrs. White. Providence was against him in the fatal breakdown of his alibi. Providence was against him in the apparently trivial fact that Newt Lee's Call of Nature Saturday night, this is a side detail, but Newt Lee, the night watchman, apparently was too lazy or whatever. He did not go upstairs to relieve himself, but instead relieved himself, took a dump in the elevator shaft. And the defense was trying to say that because the elevator then crushed his feces, it meant something, and Leo Frank was innocent. Anyways, that's what this is about. I don't know why this black guy didn't go to the upper floors to use the toilet, but he went in the elevator shaft. This is a point which he's bringing up because the defense team brought it up. I'll repeat. Providence was against him in the apparently trivial fact that Newt Lee's Call of Nature Saturday night did not occur on any of the floors above the basement, all of which had closets, but occurred in the basement where the closet was close to the dead girl. Providence was against him in the fact that Barrett worked that crank handle the last thing on Friday evening, and thus was able to credibly swear that it had no women's hair on it then. Providence was against him in that Stanford swept the whole floor Friday and was thus able to credibly swear that there was no blood on it then. Providence was against him when he was forced into explaining his absence from his office by unwittingly putting himself at the place of that woman's hair and those fresh blood spots. Providence was against him when that cold and stiff girl was found in the basement with, quote, hands folded across the breast, unquote. For that fact, apparently little imperiously demands explanation. And when you start out to hunt for the explanation which you know must exist, you search every nook and cranny in the case without finding it, until you read a line or two which the Negro did not understand the meaning of, and which, so far as I can learn, has never been the subject of comment on either side. It happened to flash across me that I had recently read something similar in a book which Walter Neal had sent me for review. And then I saw the meaning of Mary's hands being in such a position upward that Jim had to put them, quote, down, unquote. No Negro could have invented that. No Negro could have known the importance of that. Apparently the lawyers did not pay any attention to it. Am I mistaken in doing so? Am I wrong in saying that this little fact absolutely establishes the truth of the state's theory? How else do you account for the hands folded across her breast so rigidly that when her body had been dragged and then turned over, the rigid posture of the hands was maintained by the frozen muscles? To save your life, you cannot explain it, except by saying that somebody, almost immediately after the girl's death, put her hands in that position. She didn't do it. Narrator's note, what Watson is saying here is that her hands had been frozen in the upraised position, fending Leo Frankoff, she had died with and her hands had frozen in that position. But the hands were not so stiff because the rigor mortis was not ironclad. It was not so stiff that he could not budge her hands and her arms and not put them down. He was able to put her hands back down. So what this means is that the discovery of her body and the putting of the hands back down on her breast was done very shortly after she was killed. Okay, that's the point Watson's making. Okay, to repeat Watson now. To save your life, you cannot explain it except by saying that somebody, almost immediately after the girl's death, put her hands in that position. She didn't do it. Who was that somebody? Not the man who killed her, you may be dead sure. But the Negro says he did it. Then you may stake your life on the proposition that the Negro didn't kill her. Negroes who assault and murder white women don't loiter to fold hands, write notes, and pick up hats, ribbons, and slippers. Negroes who assault and murder white women have never failed to hit the outer rim of the skyline just as quick as their heels can do it. But as it was the Negro who put down the girl's hands and folded them across her breast soon after her life went out, who did kill her? The only other possible man is Frank. Was it Frank and not the Negro who was, quote, lascivious, unquote, at that factory? 12 white women swore yes. Was it Frank and not the Negro who had been after this little girl? 3 white witnesses swore yes. How many more witnesses do you need than 15 white ones? And yet the Burnses and Connollys and Pulitzers and Abels and Oxes and Thompsons and Rossers are still telling the outside world that the virtuous Frank was convicted on race prejudice and the evidence of one besotted Negro. I have here several photos to go with this caption. Hollywood movie after movie portrays the Franks as an ideal couple, handsome and noble, and martyrs to Gentile hate. And I have screenshots from several different movies, all of which show a very handsome, distinguished Leo Frank, and his wife is quite beautiful. Neither of them were beautiful. I also have an amazing close-up of Leo Frank's face. It's terrifying. He really looks like a lizard when you look at him in close-up. It scared me myself. I zoomed in with Photoshop just around his eyes and his nose and mouth, and you really get a sense of the monster that he was. Anyways, back to Watson. Was any state ever so maligned as Georgia has been? Let me call your attention to another little thing in the Negro's evidence in which there was no need to make up. It is his statement that he wrote at Frank's dictation 4 notes before Frank was satisfied. Why say 4 when only 2 were found? The Negro in testifying at the trial knew that only 2 notes were found, yet he swore to writing 4. At least I so understand his words, which were, quote, he'd taken his pencil to fix up some notes, and he sat down and I sat down at the table, and Mr. Frank dictated the notes to me. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to suit him, and he told me to turn over and write again. I turned the paper and wrote again. When I had done that, he told me to turn over and write again. And I turned over and I wrote on the next page. He looked at that and kind of liked it and said that was all right. And he reached over and got another piece of paper, a green piece, and told me what to write. He took it and laid it in his desk, unquote. If that doesn't make 4 notes, I don't understand the language in the record. And if it means 4 when only 2 were found and introduced into the case, it shows at least that the Negro was not making up a tale to fit the known facts. The Negro said another thing that he could not have made up because he does not even yet realize the meaning of it. The lawyers made no allusions to it. Jim said, quote, when I heard him whistle, in parenthesis, the signal Frank had often used when he had lewd women up in the office with him. And what this refers to, narrator's note, is Frank would bring whores into his office and have sex with them, and on Saturdays. And if a member of the public were to, or an employee were to enter the factory and head up to the second floor toward his office, then what the instructions were that Frank had given to Jim Conley was to stomp his feet as a signal that somebody was coming up the stairs, that he'd break off whatever sexual act he was doing with this prostitute. So, okay, so I'll repeat. Jim said, when I heard him whistle, the signal Frank had often used when he had lewd women with him, they had both whistling and stomping going on back and forth. I went on up the steps. Mr. Frank was standing up there at the top of the steps and shivering and trembling and rubbing his hands like this. He had a little rope in his hands, a long, wide piece of cord. His eyes were large, and they looked right funny. He asked me, "Did you see that little girl who passed up here a while ago?" Jim told him he had seen two go up and only one come down. Mind you, Frank had not heard Montine Stover, whose tennis shoes made no noise, and Frank knew nothing of her visit at all. When he asked Jim if he had seen that little girl, Frank meant, "Did you see the Fagin girl?" Frank's purpose was to learn whether Jim had seen the little girl who was then lying there in the metal room with a piece of that cord around her neck. If the nigger had answered, "No, I didn't see any girl," Frank would never have said another word to him about her. It was only after he found out that Jim had seen her go up, but not come down, that he had to take Jim into his confidence one more time. Much has been said about the improbability of Frank making a confidant out of a Negro of low character. But does an immoral white man make a confidant out of a Negro of high character? Will a respectable Negro act as a go-between, procurer, or watch-out man for a white hypocrite who is one thing to his rabbi and his B'nai B'rith, and quite a different thing to the Cyprians, it's a word meaning a wanton persons, of the town? Suppose I can show you from the official record that Frank's lawyers knew that the murder was committed on Frank's floor, back there where the blood and hair were found. Won't you be practically certain they also knew Frank to be guilty? Come along with me and see if I don't prove it to you. Leo Frank employed Harry Scott, a detective with the Pinkertons agency, to ferret out the criminal, and Scott went into the case with great vigor. In fact, he showed altogether too much vigor to suit Frank and Herbert Haas. Herbert became alarmed. Why? And Herbert told Scott to first report to him, Herbert, whatever he might discover, before letting anyone else know. Herbert Haas was chairman of the Frank Finance Committee. He was one of the lawyers for the defense. Scott did not like to be shut off from the police and confined to a Herbert Haas investigation, and so he remonstrated with the chairman of the Finance Committee. But before Scott was fired, he had drawn from Frank two material statements. One was his alleged continuous presence in his office after Hattie Hall left. The other was his answer to Mary Fagin when she asked him if the medal had come. Frank told Scott that when Mary asked him whether the medal had come, he replied, "I don't know." At that time, Frank was not aware of the fact that Montine Stover could prove that he was absent from his office when Mary was being murdered. What did Mary's question about the medal prove? That her mind was on her work. She had lost nearly a whole week because the supply of metal had run out. They were expecting more. If it had come, she could go back to work in that metal room next Monday. Therefore, when she asked Frank, "Has the medal come?" her thoughts were on her work, and she was eager to know whether she could return on Monday to resume it. "Has the medal come?" is equivalent to, "Will there be any work for me next week? Must I lose another week, or can I come back Monday?" That was the meaning of the question. What was the meaning of Frank's answer? If he said, "I don't know," the girl would naturally suggest, or he would, that they go back there to that metal room and see. Can you escape this conclusion? If he didn't know whether the medal was there or not, the only way to tell for certain was to go and look. If he was doubtful, the girl would want to go and look to see if it was there, for the girl wanted to resume her work. Now, if that answer, "I don't know," were allowed to stand, Rosser realized quick as lightning that it led to the inevitable conclusion that the girl went back to the metal room to see about it and was assaulted there. Consequently, Frank not only changed his answer of "I don't know" into a positive "no," but Rosser went at Scott hammer and tongs to badger him into saying that he may have been mistaken and that Frank may have said "no" instead of "I don't know." But the point is this. If Rosser had not felt certain that the blood in the hair proves that Mary was killed on Frank's floor, near Frank's water closet, and at about the time Frank puts himself at the closet, what would Rosser have cared whether Mary went to the metal room or not? If Jim Conley killed Mary on the first floor or in the basement, it did not at all matter whether she went to the metal room, either with Frank or by herself. The strenuous effort of Rosser to escape from that answer of "I don't know" proves what he knows. He knows very well that the girl was killed on the second floor. Otherwise, you cannot understand why Frank was made to change his statement from "I don't know" to "no," and why such Herculean strength was used to get a change out of the detective Harry Scott. The difference between "no" and "I don't know" is the difference between Tweedledum and Tweedledee, unless Mary was murdered on Frank's floor. Rosser knew, just as you must now see, that if Frank told the girl "I don't know," he might just as well have admitted that he and Mary went back there together where the blood and hair were found. The answer of "I don't know," suggesting as it did an inspection of the room to see about the metal, is the only plausible way to account for the girl's being back there, unless indeed the notes speak the truth about her going to the water closet. Rosser's desperate struggle to get away from this "I don't know" is wonderfully illuminating as to what was in Rosser's mind. If he had placed the slightest reliance on the theory that the Negro killed the girl, he would not have cared a button whether Frank went with Mary to see about the metal. If Rosser had not been absolutely certain that the girl was attacked and killed back there, he would not have struggled so hard to keep her and Frank away from there. If Rosser had believed for a moment that Mary went on downstairs after she left Frank and was killed by the Negro downstairs, he wouldn't have wasted a breath over that question of whether Frank said "no" or said "I don't know." If the girl was killed downstairs, it would not have hurt Frank's case in the least if he had boldly admitted that, after telling Mary "I don't know," he had gone back there with her to see. It is to be presumed that he, as well as she, wanted the work to go on, and therefore he also would be interested in the matter with a view to her return on Monday. Suppose he had said, "Yes, Mary came to my office, got her money, we went back to the metal room to see if the expected metal had come, and after that she went on downstairs, and I went back into my office and saw no more of her." What would have been the danger of him saying that? She was with him in the office, he admits that, after the evidence forces him to it, but why not go a little farther and admit that he and she went to the metal room before she left his floor? Ask Rosser to tell you the answer to that question. Ask your own intelligence. What danger was to be dreaded in allowing Frank to say that he and Mary went to the metal room, even for one single minute? If she was killed on the first floor, no matter who did it, there was no danger in letting Frank admit that he went to the metal room with her. If she was killed in the basement, no matter who did it, there was no danger in the admission that she and Frank went to the metal room. But Rosser's desperate drive to remove the very idea of her going to the metal room with Frank proves the immense importance he attached to it. He could not allow it. He dared not allow it. Mary and Frank must not for an instant be allowed in the metal room during that fatal half hour. Why not? Is there any possible answer but the one? And that is, Mary's tress of golden brown hair is hanging out there in that room on the crank of Barrett's machine, and Mary's lifeblood is out there on that recently swept floor. Rosser said in his heart, "I dare not let Frank go there." When you test the theory that Conley alone did the deed, you have no evidence to rest it on. Jim never bothered those white girls, did not act like a Negro who had committed the unpardonable crime on a white woman, did not try to lay suspicion on anybody, and went about his work as usual on Monday and Tuesday. There is absolutely no evidence against the Negro upon which the state could have made a shadow of a case. When you test in your mind the hypothesis that Frank and Jim both committed the crime, you make some slight headway, for Jim and Frank shielded each other until Frank was jailed. But that is not enough to implicate both in the actual crime. It is enough to prove a common guilty knowledge of the crime, but it does not shut out the idea of Conley's being accessory to the fact after the deed was done. It is only when you test in your mind the theory that Frank alone committed the crime that all proved circumstances harmonize and interlink to make the chain. 12 white girls swore that Frank had a lascivious character, and they learned what he was inside this very factory. One of his own witnesses, a white girl, swore to this immoral conduct inside this very factory. Conley mentions the names of the white women and the white man who came into this very factory to engage in vice with Frank, and one of these persons corroborated Conley on the witness stand. White witnesses swore that Frank had been after little Mary ever since March inside this very factory. Frank laid a trap for Mary by forcing her to come back inside this very factory when he might have sent her money by Helen Ferguson. Mary walks into the trap inside that factory, and it closes on her. God in heaven, was guilt ever plainer and more deliberately diabolical? And are we to be dictated to by mass meetings in Chicago and by circular letters from New York and New England when this awful crime stares us in the face? Nothing corroborates Frank when he says that Conley alone committed the crime, and every undisputed fact is against that hypothesis. Everything corroborates Conley when he says that Frank did it, and that he himself became mixed up in it only afterwards. And if there is one feature of the case more convincing than another, it is that Frank was at least as careful to shield Conley from suspicion, at first, as Conley was to shield Frank. Until Conley himself was arrested, he tried to set the dogs on Lee and Gant, but never once on Jim Conley. At first, Conley and Frank both acted like a pair who held a guilty secret between themselves. It is a heart-rending case. Big money may muzzle most of the papers, hire the best legal talent, and bring remote popular pressure to bear upon our governor. But all the money in the world cannot destroy the facts, nor answer the arguments based on those facts. Let me refer to the Negro's explanation of how it happened, my reference being confined strictly to facts where there is abundant corroboration. Jim says he heard steps of two persons going back to the metal room, and Frank himself states that Mary inquired about whether the metal had come, which would give her more work next week. What more natural than that Frank, when the girl asked, "Has the metal come?" should say, "Let's go back there and see." What is more natural than that she should go? And what is more in keeping with Frank's proved character and his proved desire for this girl than that he should make indecent advances to her back there where no one is in sight or hearing? Jim says Frank called him by their agreed signal of stamping on the floor and whistling, and that when he went up, Frank, looking wild and excited, told him, in substance, that he had tried to have the girl, that she had refused, that he had struck her, and he guessed he had hit her too hard. She had fallen, and in falling had hit something. She was unconscious. Jim says he went back there where the girl lay, at the lathe, where her hair was found in the handle, and she was lying motionless with the cord around her neck. The cloth was also tied around her neck, and part of it was under her head, like to catch blood, Conley said. All the witnesses swore to the strip of cloth, and the hair on the metal handle of the lathe was as fully identified as Mary's as hair could be under those circumstances. Frank's own witness, Magnolia Kennedy, testified that the hair looked like Mary's, and Miss Magnolia was herself the only other girl there whose hair was at all like the golden brown of Mary Fagan's. Frank's own machinist found the hair on the metal handle and swore positively it was not there when he quit using that very machine, handle and all, Friday night, before the Saturday of the crime. Mr. Barrett, the machinist, found the hair on the handle when he went back to the machine Monday morning. He was not at the factory Saturday. No one is shown to have been in that room Saturday. How did that long golden brown woman's hair get on that metal crank where Barrett found it? No girl or woman could be produced to pretend that she was in the metal room on Saturday. Narrator's note, again, there was no work on Saturday, and it was also Confederate Memorial Day. There was a parade in town. There's no reason for any woman to be there on Saturday. Back to Watson. No girl or woman could be found who could explain about the hair. Why not? Half a dozen of Frank's own employees, several of them his own witnesses, swore to finding the hair soon on Monday morning, and they swore that it was not there Friday. Why couldn't it be accounted for? The only answer is, Mary, in falling after Frank struck her and gave her the bruise on the eye, hit the metal handle, and it ripped her scalp and tore out some of her hair. In no other way under the sun can that hair on the machine be explained. Then the blood on the floor of the dressing room, some 23 feet from where the girl fell. Whose blood? All the witnesses say it was not there Friday when they quit work. Mel Stanford had swept the whole second floor and tidied up generally, and he swore positively the blood spots were not there Friday. Barrett swore they were not there Friday, but the blood spots were there early Monday morning, seen by numbers of employees and denied by none. Schiff, the assistant superintendent, admitted it. Quinn admitted it. The men saw it. The women saw it. Chips were cut out of the floor, and the doctors saw it. Whose was it? Not there Friday evening, but right there Monday morning. So whose was it? If not Mary's blood, produce your explanation. If not Mary, someone else bled there. Who bled there between Friday and Monday, if not Mary Fagan? The question cannot be answered save in one way. You know quite well that if money or skill or hard work, by narrator's note by Frank's Dream Team lawyers, could have accounted for those guilty stains on that floor, the man or the woman who bled there would have been produced. Conley says he dropped the girl on the floor, and that the blood spattered where those spots were found. Take that explanation or go without one, for I assure you the court record offers no other. Frank, in his own statement, could only offer the explanation that Duffy or Gilbert, when injured in the metal room months before, might have bled there. Gilbert went on the stand and swore to his cut finger, but said none of the blood had dropped anywhere near those spots. The futile effort to account for the blood only deepens the significance of the fact that it was there, and adds fearful weight to the evidence of R.P. Barrett and Mel Stanford that it was not there on Friday. Jim says he and Frank carried the body down in the elevator to the basement. He says they had wrapped her up in a cloth, which was taken off in the basement. He said that Frank made him promise to return to the plant that afternoon to help him dispose of the body, but he did not go back. I have on purpose left out everything but the barest outline. Conley did go home and did not return, whereas Frank was back, we don't know exactly when, and sent Newt Lee away at 4 when Newt wanted to go in and sleep. A white man whose character is not assailed swears that he wanted permission to go into the factory at 6:00 p.m. that Saturday, and that Frank not only tried to dodge back out of sight into the gloom of the building, but lied to him about the sweeping out of the shoes, and then sent a Negro to watch him. Then the Negro, who was a trusted night watchman, and whom Frank detailed to watch Gant, swears that when he went down into the basement at 7 o'clock in the course of his regular rounds of the big building, less than an hour after Frank had gone, the light that had always been kept burning brightly there by Frank's own orders had been turned down. Quote, "It was burning just as low as you could turn it, like a lightning bug. I left it Saturday morning burning bright." Who turned that light down? Who went into that basement after Newt went off duty early Saturday morning? Who was there during Saturday? What was the motive in turning the light down and leaving it so? The motive was to prevent Newt from seeing that corpse. Not a single employee of the plant said that he or she had been in the basement that day. The light could not turn itself down. It was not a case of the gas burning dim and low, for it burned brightly again when turned up. Somebody turned down the light. Who? Over the telephone came the inquiry to Newt. "How is everything?" That was an hour or so after Frank had left. He had never done that before. He does not even claim that he had. But he explains it by saying he wanted to know whether Gant had gone. What danger did he apprehend from Gant? Narrator's note, Gant was just there to pick up some shoes he had left behind when Frank fired him, and Gant was also the one protective of Mary Fagan. Maybe that's why Leo Frank fired the bookkeeper, Gant. Back to Watson. Why was Gant on Frank's nerves? Newt swears that Frank did not mention Gant, but simply asked, "How is everything?" Was it not the jangling nerves and haunting suspicions, whose question really meant, "Have you found anything? Have you seen the dead girl? Is the murder out?" Minola McKnight's repudiated affidavit is in this terrible record, and in those statements which she verified and swore to in the presence of Mr. George Gordon, her attorney, she tells of that night of horror at Frank's home. Narrator's note: McKnight was the black maid at the Frank home, and she signed a statement to the Atlanta police that she overheard Leo Frank confess the murder to his wife. She later, quote, withdrew her statement, unquote. Back to Watson. You will probably suspect that if Newt Lee had not had the occasion to go to the closet in the basement that night, Mary Fagan's body never would have been found, for the going to the closet took him close to the corpse, and he saw it. Frank did not intend for the corpse to be found, and he meant to creep back into the basement next day and bury that girl in the dirt floor. That door worked on a slide, by the way. It did not open as door shutters usually do. It was locked and it was barred, usually. On Saturday night, Newt looked that way and it was closed. He did not notice the bar or the staple. On Sunday morning, the door was subjected to close examination. The witnesses say the staple had been drawn and the bar taken down, but the door was completely closed. Would a frightened, fleeing Negro rapist and murderer, having pried out the staple, lift it off the bar, and then carefully from the outside push the door to on the slide? Why should Jim Conley break the basement door when he could walk out in front on the first floor where he was sitting when Mrs. White saw him? Why should any frightened and fleeing Negro, too scared to walk out of the unlocked doors, break that door and then carefully close it? To me, it looks like a careful plan for somebody to go in without being seen. To me, it looks as if somebody who had the run of the plant came down there, pried out the staple, and lifted the bar without opening the door at all. The opening was to be from the outside next day. Narrator's note: so Frank could sneak in and bury the body in the dirt basement floor. Of course, Mary's relatives would sound the alarm about the missing daughter long before he could execute any such scheme, and the police were already calling Frank at his home. Back to Watson. Jim Conley could have unlocked that door easier than he could withdraw the staple. He could have lifted the bar and gone out without violence, easier than he could go out by a burglarious breaking. It wasn't a question of going out, it was a question of somebody coming in. Do you say that Frank could have left the door unlocked with the bar merely lifted off? The answer to that is, had he done so, he would have had to involve persons who had the keys. To unlock from the inside, there must be an unlocker on the inside. Now, Frank had unlocked the door as well as removed the bar. The crime would have come home right then to one of the men who toted the keys, and a narrowing circle would have brought that search right up to him and Conley. For all the others could easily account for themselves at the exact half hour of the crime. What will you think of their sincerity and honesty when I tell you that page 21 of the agreed record shows that the Negro was sitting near the front door, upstairs, on the first floor, at about 1 o'clock, when Mrs. J. A. White passed him and went out at the front door? What hindered the Negro from walking out the front door? The crime had been committed, the corpse was in the basement, and there was Jim sitting between the upper stairway and regular entrance door. What need for him to squeeze through that scuttle hole, return to the basement, and break out the back way into the alley? All he or Frank had to do to get out was to do what Mrs. White did, walk out. But if somebody wanted to come back around the back way and glide into the basement unseen, then a sliding door, left in such a manner that it could be pushed back from the outside, was necessary. Another queer thing is that Jim said that they left the corpse on the floor in front of the elevator, but that he flung the ribbon, hat, and slippers into the trash heap near the furnace, where Frank wanted body and all burnt that afternoon. Now, when the body was found, it had been dragged from the elevator back to near the basement door. The ribbon, slippers, and hat were at the same place, and only 2 notes, a white one and a yellow one, were lying near the girl's head. Did Frank, who was a small man, drag that body away from the elevator? Did he gather up all her things and lay them by her? Did he select 2 of the notes and destroy the other 2? Did the other 2 notes go with her mesh bag and pay envelope into the safe? It is certainly a peculiar detail that Newt Lee, when an accident took him to the toilet near the corpse, saw the leg first. In being dragged by the feet and on the side face, at least one of the legs would be exposed. Nobody but Frank and Conley are entrapped by that providential clockwork of the fatal half hour. Conley admits himself caught and is being punished for it. But it catches Frank also, and where two criminals are involved in a crime against a white girl, the white man is the more apt to be the leader, the principal, especially in a case like this, where 10 white women swore to Frank's lewd character, and 3 white witnesses swore that he'd been after this very girl. What is a demonstration of any man's guilt on circumstantial evidence? It is that degree of moral certainty which arises from the evident fact that under those circumstances no one else could have committed the crime. Given a murder and a state of facts which excludes everybody else except the accused, then the accused is the guilty man necessarily. When it is admitted that somebody committed a crime, testimony shows that nobody but the defendant could have done it, human reason is satisfied, and so is the law. Let your mind rest upon one other very significant fact. The ignorant Negro who is accused of the crime stood a terrific cross-examination lasting 8 hours. The strongest criminal lawyer of the Atlanta bar wore himself out on Jim Conley without damaging Jim's evidence in the least. Narrator's note, and here I have some things to say about Jim Conley. Jim Conley was an average or below average black guy in 1913 Georgia. He'd been to jail for drunkenness and fighting, and after this whole trial, he would do years for burglarizing a liquor store. But on the stand, he really impressed an all-white Southern jury. In the 1930s, long after the crime and the trial, Conley paid a remorseful, respectful visit to the Fagan Coleman family to explain that day to her mother and Mary Fagan's stepfather, and how he had feared to disobey Leo Frank, yet refused to burn the body, instead laid her things by her and folded her arms across her chest. This is found in the book by Mary's great niece, Mary Fagan Keene, who heard all the family stories. The family reiterated to Jim Conley their belief in his innocence. Mr. John William Coleman, the stepfather, said, "Jim, if I thought you did it, I would strike you dead as sure as I'm standing here." Back to Watson. On the contrary, the educated white man, Leo Frank, who was accused of the crime, made a statement covering 45 large pages of closely printed matter and refused to offer to answer one single question. Narrator's note, Frank both refused to testify under oath and refused to let the prosecution cross-examine him. Back to Watson. His defenders paint Leo Frank as a man of intellectual gifts, of which any community should be proud, as a man of spotless morals, as a man who was unjustly accused, foully convicted, and eager for vindication. Why then did he shrink from a cross-examination? Why did he fear an ordeal through which the Negro janitor triumphantly passed? In its tenderness to the accused, our law will not permit an examination of the defendant. Narrator's note, under the U.S. Constitution, under the Fifth Amendment, nobody can be forced to testify against himself. Back to Watson, unless he voluntarily consents. So just was the horror of our ancestors against that system of torture to compel confessions which Popery had introduced into Europe, that they swung the pendulum back to the other extreme and screened the prisoner from any question whatsoever. Narrator's note, what this means is that you can have an entire trial where the person accused, the defendant, never testifies at all, because the defendant can literally refuse to testify. And then you have to prove the case through other witnesses and other evidence. So that is the Anglo-Saxon law, that the defendant does not have to testify, and the defendant can refuse to be cross-examined. In other words, examined by the prosecutor, examined by the other side. And Leo Frank chose not to be cross-examined. He did not testify under oath, and he did not allow himself to be questioned about what he had said and what he had claimed. And 45 pages of him saying his side of the story, his version of events, but he did not allow himself to be questioned about any of his statements. Okay, back to Watson. It is an unwise thing that we give to the guilty an immunity from answering fair questions, for no innocent man could ever be hurt by it. But leaving all that out, a defendant can say, and often does say, "Ask me any fair question, and I will answer it." Such an offer always makes a most favorable impression. The jury and the public at once begin to feel confident of the innocence of an accused when he shows confidence in it himself. Here was a college graduate, an intellectually superior man, environed by a terrible array of suspicious circumstances, with the whole republic looking on at his trial, with the mother and father intensely agitated, and the Hebrews of the Union profoundly concerned. What a magnificent opportunity for an innocent man to rise before the court and the country, panoplied in the armor of conscious rectitude, and say to the state of Georgia, "I have nothing to conceal. There are no guilty secrets in my soul. The more carefully you open my book of life, the more clearly will my innocence be seen. If I have not spoken to your satisfaction and given a full account of myself, ask me about it. Put your questions. I'm not afraid. No answer of mine can uncover a guilt that does not exist. Therefore, I do not fear your questions. Ask them." Wouldn't that have been the attitude and the feeling of Nathan Strauss, for instance, had he been in Frank's place? What then is the net result of all this evidence? Direct and circumstantial. It is this: Leo Frank was a lecherous hypocrite, a moral pervert, a model to Rabbi Marx, but a rake and something more to women who would allow it. He wanted this little girl, and the opportunity came on Saturday, April 26, 1913. She goes into his possession and is found in his possession, but when she goes in, she is alive and well, and when found, she is cold and stiff, with the dried blood matted in her golden hair, and a tightly tied cord cutting into her soft neck. Alive and dead, she is in that day in Frank's possession, and he cannot trace her out of it. To say that the Negro shared that possession with him may be true, but it does not help Frank. At most, that gives him an accomplice, and the Negro is even now being punished for that. Narrator's note: Conley was in jail from the murder in April 1913 through the August 1913 trial, and then did a year in prison as an accomplice after the fact. Back to Watson. Mary goes into Frank's house alive. She's soon afterwards found there dead, cold, and stiff. No mortals had the opportunity to assault and kill her, save Frank and Conley. Say that the Negro did the deed without the white man, and you cannot travel at all. No evidence whatsoever supports that theory. Say that the white man did it, and then called for the Negro's help in getting rid of the body afterward, and all the evidence harmonizes. Facts link into facts to make the iron chain of conviction. On the great Knapp case, narrator's note, K-N-A-P-P, a German name, is a murder case in the 1830s in Massachusetts. Okay, back to Watson. Okay. On the great Knapp case, the fame of Daniel Webster as a criminal lawyer mainly rests, and in that case of circumstantial evidence, the verdict of guilty had no stronger support than was given to the verdict against Frank. In the Knapp case, the prosecution aided the state of Massachusetts by employing the greatest lawyer and forensic orator the American bar could boast. In the Frank case, the young solicitor, that is prosecutor, stood alone and fought the strongest team of attorneys that money could enlist. Against Frank's dozens of lawyers, detectives, press agents, etc., the state of Georgia has arrayed nobody save her regular officers of the law. In the Knapp case, Mr. Webster indignantly answered the friends of the defendant, who claimed that a popular clamor had been excited against the accused. He turned upon these two zealous champions of the prisoner and exclaimed, "Much has been said on this occasion of the excitement which has existed and still exists, and of the extraordinary methods taken to discover and punish the guilty. No doubt there has been and is much excitement, and strange indeed were it, had it been otherwise. Should not all the peaceable and well-disposed naturally feel concerned, and naturally exert themselves to bring to punishment the authors of this secret assassination? Was it a thing to be slept upon or forgotten? Did you, gentlemen, sleep quite as quietly in your beds after this murder as before? Was it not a case for rewards, for meetings, for committees, for the united efforts of all the good, to find out a band of murderous conspirators, of midnight ruffians, and to bring them to the bar of justice and law? If this be excitement, is it an unnatural or an improper excitement? It is said that even a vigilance committee was appointed. They are said to have labored for months against the prisoner. Gentlemen, what must we do in such a case? Are people to be dumb and still, through fear of overdoing? Is it come to this that an effort cannot be made, a hand cannot be lifted to discover the guilty, without its being said there is a combination to overwhelm innocence? Has the committee lost all moral sense? Certainly a community that would not be roused to action upon an occasion such as this, a community which should not deny sleep to their eyes and slumber to their eyelids till they had exhausted all the means of discovery and detection, must indeed be lost to all moral sense, and would scarcely deserve protection from our laws. Thus thundered Daniel Webster, rebuking those men of New England who blamed the people of Massachusetts for being aroused over the murder of an old man. Narrator's note: by way of explanation, in this 1830 case of murder for hire, a great-nephew with his brother hired a hitman to kill his wealthy great-uncle, a Captain White, so they could inherit $200,000, today $4 million. Poor old Captain White was clubbed and stabbed to death in his bed. The hitman was arrested, hanged himself in jail, and thanks to Webster, the two brothers and great-nephews were hanged for plotting the crime. Great God, what would Webster have said to those New York preachers and those northern papers who are so fiercely misrepresenting and denouncing the people of Georgia for being aroused over the murder of a little girl? Nobly expounding the purpose of the penal law, Mr. Webster said, quote, "The criminal law is not founded on a principle of vengeance. The humanity of the law regrets every pain it causes, every hour of restraint it imposes, and the more deeply still, every life it forfeits. But it uses evil as the means of preventing greater evil. It seeks to deter from crime by the example of punishment. This is its true and only true main object. It forfeits the life of the murderer, that other murders may not be committed. When the guilty, therefore, are not punished, the law has so far failed of its purpose. The safety of the innocent is so far endangered. Every unpunished murder takes away something from the security of every man's life." End of quote. In pressing the case on Leo Frank, the state of Georgia has been free from any hostility toward a Jew. The state has sternly prosecuted him because he is a murderer. In pressing the case against Leo Frank, we have felt none of the fury of prejudice and race hatred. We have demanded his punishment as a protection to other innocent Mary Fagans, as well as a vindication of the law to strike terror into other Leo Franks. We respectfully ask the other states of the Union to usurp no further jurisdiction over us than a high court of review would have, and that would be to examine the official record as agreed upon by the attorneys on both sides and judge us by that record. If the sworn testimony supports the verdict of the jury, quit abusing us. If that sworn testimony not only sustains the evidence, but rendered any other verdict humanly impossible, quit talking about the semi-barbarians of Georgia, accusing them of Jew-baiting, mob methods, and jungle fury. Unless Frank is entitled to some immunity just because he is a Jew, then let the lightnings of Sinai strike him. A married man, he was false to his young and buxom wife. A member of the synagogue, he was false to the creed of his church. An educated Hebrew of splendid connections, he was false to the higher standards of his race. A citizen of Georgia, he was false to her society, a canker and a pest. Subject to her laws, he broke them repeatedly, with shameless effrontery. In his place of business, And when one Gentile girl whom he lusted after persisted in repulsing him, he laid in wait for her, assaulted her, killed her, leaving her blood and her corpse in his place of business. Narrators, now we come to the end of this entire article by publisher Thomas Watson. Oh, my lords and gentlemen, what must we do to be saved from such men as these? Every race has them, every state has them, every nation has them. Please God, I have written an argument that will vindicate our state, justify her courts, defy refutation, and stand unshaken to the end of time. That my work has been done voluntarily and without reward, or the remotest hope thereof, will not lessen its merit. The end.
I'm always light-hearted. This world have I know I'm loved by a daisy that I couldn't forgive if I tried. She sleeps far away in the mountain, while the little bird sings in the tree. Little grave it's covered in ivory, our loved ones are waiting for thee. Covered in the grave that's in Marietta, and it is not far away. Little grave that's in Marietta, a soul with the angels today. Only here with the mother, how happy that poor soul would be. She sleeps now in the little graveyard, while the little bird sings in the tree. The little Mary was just 14, she's pretty as a queen. Her hair was dark and curly, the sweetest child ever was seen. Lonely here with the mother, how happy that poor soul was seen. She sleeps now in the little graveyard, while the little bird sings in the tree. The day she left her dear mother, that we shall never forget. The morning she walked to the car line, I fancy I see her too yet. She was only here with the mother, how happy that poor soul would be. She sleeps now in the little graveyard, while the little bird sings in the tree.